Imagine you are scrolling through the Forbes billionaires list sometime in the early months of 2022. You are perhaps sitting in your apartment, or maybe you are on a commuter train, or maybe you are in the back of a rideshare somewhere, killing time between obligations, and you encounter a name you have never seen before. Alexandr Wang, 25 years old, net worth $1 billion, industry, artificial intelligence. And next to his name, there is a photograph of a young man, clean-cut, composed, of Chinese descent, wearing the quiet confidence of someone who appears to have solved a problem the rest of the world has not yet fully articulated. And in that moment, something shifts inside you. Not admiration, exactly. Something deeper, more corrosive, more structurally significant than admiration. What shifts is your model of reality. Because when you see a 25-year-old billionaire on the Forbes list, especially one operating in artificial intelligence, a field that, at that point in 2022, most consumers could barely define, let alone navigate, your brain does not process this as a neutral data point. Your brain processes it as a verdict on you, a verdict on the distance between where you are and where someone like that is. And that distance, in that moment, feels infinite. It feels categorical. It feels like the kind of gap that cannot be closed by effort, by discipline, by ambition, by grinding, by anything you could plausibly do within the span of a human lifetime. And the reason it feels that way is not because the gap is actually that large. The reason it feels that way is because you are missing information. You are missing a tremendous amount of information. And the information you are missing is not trivial. It is not some biographical footnote or lucky break that you could wave away as an exception to the rule. The information you are missing is the entire architecture behind how that name ended up on that list. The full, hidden, structurally determinative architecture that operates beneath the surface of every single success story you have ever encountered, but that the narrative conventions of media, of culture, of the mythology of the American dream are specifically, deliberately, architecturally designed to prevent you from seeing. What I'm going to lay out in this commentary is going to dismantle a narrative so thoroughly, so precisely, and with such an unflinching level of structural specificity that by the time you fully absorb what is being said, your understanding of success, of merit, of genius, of the American dream, and of how outcomes are actually produced in this society will be fundamentally and irreversibly altered. This is not hyperbole. This is not clickbait framing. This is the result of pulling a single thread, the thread of one man's biography, and watching an entire tapestry of hidden systems, invisible architectures, and structural asymmetries unravel in front of you in a way that reveals the machinery behind not just this one story, but behind every story like it. Behind every story of a young founder who seems to have transcended the normal constraints of human capability. Behind every Forbes profile that makes you feel like you are fundamentally different from the person on the page. Behind every keynote speech, every podcast interview, every media narrative that tells you that the difference between extraordinary outcomes and ordinary outcomes is located inside the individual rather than inside the system. Let us begin with the surface level narrative, the one you would encounter if you Googled Alexandr Wang right now. You would find a story that reads like a Silicon Valley fairy tale. Born in 1997 in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Parents were physicists, showed an early aptitude for mathematics and computer science, won competitions, math counts at the national level, performed well in the USA Computing Olympiad, attended MIT to study mathematics and computer science, dropped out at age 19, co-founded a company called Scale AI with Lucy Guo, whom he met while working at the question and answer platform Quora. The company provided data labeling services for artificial intelligence systems. Essentially, it organized and annotated the massive data sets that machine learning models need in order to learn. The company was accepted into Y Combinator's summer 2016 batch. It grew. It secured contracts with autonomous vehicle companies, then with the United States military, then with the largest AI companies on the planet, OpenAI, Meta, Microsoft. The company's valuation climbed from tens of millions to hundreds of millions to billions. By 2022, Wang's 15% ownership stake made him a billionaire. He was named the youngest self-made billionaire in the world by Forbes. And in June of 2025, Meta Platforms invested $14.3 billion in Scale AI, acquiring a 49% stake and bringing Wang into Meta's leadership structure. The end. That is the story as it is told. And every single element of that story is technically true. And yet that story, in its totality, is one of the most misleading narratives you will ever encounter. Not because it contains lies, not because any individual fact is fabricated, but because the story is architected, and I use that word with full deliberateness and precision, it is architected to make you draw a very specific set of conclusions that serve the mythology of individual transcendence, while systematically, comprehensively, and by structural design concealing the invisible machinery that actually produced the outcome you are marveling at. Let me tell you what the mythology of individual transcendence is, because understanding this mythology is the prerequisite for understanding everything that follows. The mythology of individual transcendence is perhaps the single most powerful ideological instrument in American life. It is more powerful than any political party. It is more pervasive than any religion. It is more deeply embedded in the culture than any constitutional principle. It is the belief, the foundational, unexamined, ambient belief that saturates every media narrative, every commencement speech, every entrepreneurship podcast, every motivational Instagram post, that extraordinary outcomes are the product of extraordinary individuals, that the billionaire is a billionaire because of some ineffable quality that resides within them, some unique configuration of genius and will and vision and work ethic and risk tolerance that separates them from the masses, that if you could only isolate that quality, bottle it, replicate it, internalize it, you too could produce extraordinary outcomes. That the hierarchy of wealth and success in American society is, at its core, a hierarchy of individual capability. That the people at the top are there because they are better, and that the people in the middle or at the bottom are there because they are, by some measure, less. This mythology serves a very specific structural function. It is not just a story. It is a load-bearing wall in the architecture of American social organization. It is the mechanism by which the system justifies itself to the people who are harmed by it. Because if extraordinary outcomes are the product of extraordinary individuals, then the system that produces wildly unequal outcomes is not unjust. It is meritocratic. The hierarchy is earned. The distance between the person scrolling through Forbes on a commuter train and the 25-year-old billionaire on the page is the natural, legitimate, morally defensible consequence of a difference in capability. And if that distance makes you feel inadequate, then the inadequacy is yours, not the system's. The mythology tells you to look inward, at your own perceived deficiencies, rather than outward, at the structural conditions that produced and maintain the disparity. The mythology of individual transcendence is not just a story people tell. It is a containment mechanism. It is a form of compliance architecture in itself. It keeps people inside the system, playing by the system's rules, blaming themselves for the system's outcomes. And what I'm going to do, across 20 sections of the most structurally detailed, hyper-technical, asymmetrically nuanced analysis you have ever heard, is dismantle that mythology. Not with opinion, not with ideology, not with resentment, with architecture. With the actual, granular, verifiable structural mechanics that produced the outcome called Alexandr Wang, billionaire. I'm going to show you, piece by piece, layer by layer, with a level of specificity that will make it impossible to dismiss as generalization or hand-waving exactly how a very specific confluence of inherited advantages, institutional pipelines, systemic selection mechanisms, temporal coincidences, network geometries, narrative manufactures, labor extraction systems, and geopolitical forces converged to produce an outcome that appears transcendent from the outside, but is, from the inside, far more legible, far more reproducible in its structural logic, and far more dependent on invisible scaffolding than the mythology would ever permit you to see. Now, I want to be very precise here, because precision is what separates structural analysis from cynicism, and this commentary is not cynical. What I'm not saying is that Alexandr Wang is unintelligent. He's clearly intelligent. What I'm not saying is that he has no talent. He clearly has talent. What I'm not saying is that he contributed nothing to the outcome. He contributed effort, decision-making, execution, and a certain structural awareness that, as we will see, is itself a product of his structural position. What I'm saying, what the architecture says when you map it with sufficient granularity, is that intelligence and talent, in the absence of the specific structural configuration that surrounded him, would not have been sufficient to produce this outcome. Full stop. And conversely, and this is the part that should truly arrest you, there are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of individuals with equivalent or greater intelligence and talent who did not and will not produce this outcome. Not because they lack the requisite qualities, but because they lack the requisite architecture. They lack the specific, contingent, non-replicable configuration of structural advantages that made each step of Wang's trajectory possible. And that distinction, the distinction between individual capability and structural architecture as the primary driver of extreme outcomes, is the hidden secret. That is the thing that is not said. That is the thing that the Forbes profile by design structurally cannot say. Because if it said it, the mythology collapses. And if the mythology collapses, then the legitimacy of the hierarchy it justifies collapses with it. And the people who benefit most from that hierarchy, the investors, the institutions, the systems that extract value from the belief that outcomes are individually earned, have every incentive to maintain the mythology and suppress the architecture. Not through conspiracy, not through explicit coordination, but through the simple, relentless, structurally determined gravitational pull of narrative convention. The story of the genius founder is a story that gets clicks, that gets funding, that gets published, that gets shared, that gets internalized. The story of the structural architecture that produced the genius founder is a story that does not get told, not because it is untrue, but because it is structurally inconvenient. So what we are going to do systematically across the entirety of this commentary is reconstruct the architecture. we are going to trace the invisible wiring. We are going to map the pipelines. We are going to identify the selection mechanisms. We are going to examine the structural preconditions that made each step of this story not just possible but probable, given the configuration. And we are going to do it with such granularity, such precision, and such intellectual rigor that by the end, you will not be able to look at a Forbes list, or a LinkedIn profile, or a keynote speech, or a startup funding announcement, or a media profile of any successful person the same way ever again. You will see the architecture, you will see the scaffolding, you will see the invisible hands, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. That is the promise, and that is where we begin. Because before we even get to Alexandr Wang's biography, before we get to Los Alamos and the physicists and the cultural scripts and MIT and the compliance architecture and Cora and Lucy Guo and the Thiel Fellowship and Y Combinator and the pivot and the autonomous vehicles and the scaling laws and the Pentagon contracts and the Sam Altman connection and the Meta acquisition, before we get to any of that, we have to build the lens through which all of it becomes legible. We have to construct the analytical framework that transforms a biography into a structural revelation. And the framework has three components. The first is what I call the compliance architecture of American institutions, the invisible lattice of unstated expectations that determines who persists within a system and who is expelled. The second is the invisible system of precarity, the multidimensional field of vulnerabilities that gives systems leverage over individuals and determines how much autonomy any given person actually possesses within the systems they inhabit. And the third is what I call resolution arbitrage, the hidden mechanism by which individuals who are expelled from one pipeline can find outsized returns in an adjacent system, not because their capabilities change, but because the system's ability to evaluate them changes. These three concepts, compliance, architecture, precarity, and resolution arbitrage, are the skeleton keys. They are the tools that unlock the hidden room behind every Forbes profile, behind every success narrative, behind every mythology of transcendence. And once we have built these tools with the full level of technical precision and depth they require, we will apply them to the specific biography of Alexandr Wang. And what will emerge will not be a diminished story. It will be a more impressive story than the mythology tells, because the true story, the structural story, reveals a machinery of such complexity, such interlocking precision, such dependence on invisible forces operating at scales from the personal to the geopolitical, that the simple narrative of genius founds company seems, by comparison, embarrassingly inadequate. The reality is richer. The reality is wilder. The reality is more instructive. And the reality is what we are going to see. So let us build the lens, let us start with compliance architecture, and let us go somewhere that no one has gone before. Every system you have ever moved through in American life, every school, every employer, every institution, every relationship that involves any form of hierarchy or resource allocation or gatekeeping, operates on what can be understood as a compliance architecture. And before you dismiss this as an abstract sociological concept, I need you to understand that compliance architecture is the single most operationally relevant idea in this entire commentary. It is the concept that explains why some people thrive inside systems and others do not, why some people are promoted and others are stalled, why some people are retained and others are expelled, and why the explanations that systems give for these outcomes, merit, performance, culture fit, are almost always incomplete and frequently misleading. Compliance architecture is the invisible operating system running beneath the visible interface of every institution you have ever encountered. And if you do not understand it, you cannot understand anything about how outcomes are actually produced in American life. So what is compliance architecture? A compliance architecture is the total set of unstated rules, behavioral expectations, temporal constraints, aesthetic norms, social navigation requirements, and emotional absorption demands that an individual must adhere to in order to remain within a system and access its resources. Notice the word I emphasized, unstated. This is absolutely critical. Compliance architecture is not the job description. It is not the syllabus. It is not the employee handbook. It is not the admissions criteria. Those are the stated rules. The stated rules are what the system tells you it evaluates you on. The compliance architecture is what the system actually evaluates you on. And the distance between what a system says it evaluates and what it actually evaluates is where the real filtering happens. The real filtering, the filtering that determines who advances and who stagnates, who is retained and who is expelled, who is promoted and who is managed out, happens on the unstated dimensions, the dimensions that nobody explains to you when you enter the system, the dimensions that you are expected to intuit, to absorb through osmosis, to decode from the ambient behavioral patterns of the people who are succeeding within the system. Let me break this down with a level of specificity that will make the concept fully tangible, because I need you to feel this in your body, not just understand it intellectually. Consider the compliance architecture of a standard American workplace. You are hired for a job. The job description says you need to be proficient in a certain set of technical skills. You are proficient. You exceed the technical requirements. You are, by the stated metrics, an excellent hire. But the compliance architecture of that workplace says something entirely different from what the job description says. And the compliance architecture is what will determine whether you advance, stagnate, or are eventually expelled. The compliance architecture says you need to be in the office from 8 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, not because your cognitive peak is between 8 and 5. It may be between midnight and 4 in the morning, and you may produce your best work in that window. Not because the work requires synchronous presence for 9 consecutive hours. Much of modern knowledge work is asynchronous and could be performed at any time. But because the system's ability to monitor, contain, and extract value from you depends on temporal regularity. The 8 to 5 schedule is not an efficiency optimization. It is a containment protocol. It is a mechanism that allows the system to verify your presence, monitor your behavior, and enforce the implicit social contract that says your time belongs to the institution for a defined block of hours, regardless of whether those hours are productive. And if you resist this, if you propose alternative hours, if you work remotely when the system expects in-person presence, if you demonstrate that you are more productive outside the prescribed schedule, you are not being more efficient. You are being non-compliant. And non-compliance in the calculus of the system is more threatening than underperformance. An underperforming employee who is compliant can be managed. A high-performing employee who is non-compliant is an existential threat to the system's ability to maintain itself. The compliance architecture says you need to communicate in a specific register, not too casual. That signals lack of seriousness. Not too formal. That signals rigidity or social awkwardness. Not too assertive. That signals threat, especially if you are a woman or a person of color. Not too passive. That signals lack of leadership potential. The specific register that is considered appropriate is not defined anywhere. It is not in the employee handbook. It is not in the corporate values statement. It is encoded in the behavioral patterns of the people who have been selected by the system, the people who have already demonstrated their containability, and it must be reverse engineered through careful observation by every new entrant to the system. And the people who reverse engineer it fastest, the people who intuit the register most quickly, are almost always the people who grew up in environments where that register was ambient, where the communication norms of the professional class were modeled in their homes, in their schools, in their social circles. This is not a coincidence. This is a feature of the system. The compliance architecture is calibrated to the cultural norms of the people who built the system, which means it is structurally easier to navigate for people who share the cultural background of the system's builders and structurally harder to navigate for people who do not. The compliance architecture says you need to absorb certain inefficiencies without complaint, pointless meetings that consume hours of your day without producing any actionable outcome, redundant reporting processes that exist not to capture useful information, but to create the appearance of accountability, performative busy work, the corporate equivalent of make work, that has no purpose other than to fill the hours between 8 and 5 and to signal to the system that you are occupied, engaged, and compliant. Your willingness to absorb these inefficiencies without visible frustration is itself a metric. It is a containability metric. It is the system testing whether you can be governed, whether you can subordinate your individual judgment about what constitutes productive work to the system's definition of productive work. And if you fail this test, if you visibly chafe at pointless meetings, if you push back on redundant processes, if you ask why a particular task is necessary and in a tone that suggests you believe it is not, you are flagged, not as inefficient, as uncontainable. And here is the insight that is absolutely essential to everything that follows in this commentary. Systems do not select purely for competence. Systems select for containability. This is not a bug. This is not a flaw in the system that could be corrected with better management practices. This is the system operating exactly as designed. Because the purpose of a system, any system, whether it is an employer, a university, a military branch, a professional association, a social institution, the purpose of a system is not to maximize the output of any individual participant. The purpose of a system is to maintain the system, to perpetuate its own existence, to ensure its own continuity. And ensuring continuity requires predictability, regularity, and compliance. It requires that the individuals within the system behave in ways that are consistent, governable, and subordinate to the system's needs. The most competent individual in the world, the most brilliant engineer, the most insightful analyst, the most creative designer, if they cannot be contained within the compliance architecture of a given system, will be expelled from that system. And a less competent individual who is highly containable, who shows up on time, communicates in the right register, absorbs inefficiencies without complaint, navigates social hierarchies with the appropriate blend of deference and initiative, and presents no threat to the system's operational stability. That individual will be retained. They will be promoted. They will be celebrated as a high performer, not because they produce the most value, but because they are the most governable. And in the calculus of the system, governability is more valuable than productivity. Now, I need you to take this framework and extend it beyond the workplace, because compliance architecture is not limited to employment. It operates in every system in American life, and understanding its pervasiveness is essential to understanding the story of Alexandr Wang. Consider the compliance architecture of a university, specifically an elite university like MIT. The stated admissions criteria say that the university selects for academic excellence, intellectual curiosity, and the potential to contribute to the university community. These criteria are real, but they are the outer layer. The compliance architecture, the inner layer, the unstated set of expectations that determine who thrives within the MIT ecosystem, is far more granular, far more culturally specific, and far more consequential. The compliance architecture of MIT's computer science program says you need to manage your cognitive load across a course load that is designed to be overwhelming, not challenging, overwhelming. The problem sets are long, sometimes taking 20 or 30 hours per week per class. The mathematical rigor expected is extreme. The pace is unrelenting, and the system does not care whether you learn best through the pace it sets. The system sets the pace based on its own needs, the need to compress 4 years of content into a format that can be evaluated, graded, and ranked. And your job is to conform to that pace. If your cognitive rhythms, your learning style, your emotional processing, your social needs do not align with the system's temporal demands, the friction is yours to absorb. The system will not adjust. The compliance architecture says you need to build relationships with specific faculty members, not just any faculty members. The faculty members who run the research labs that produce the publications that signal research prowess to graduate programs and employers. These relationships are not established through academic merit alone. They are established through a complex social process that involves attending office hours, participating in the right seminars, demonstrating the right kind of intellectual curiosity, not too broad, not too narrow, aligned with the faculty members' research interests, and navigating the implicit social dynamics of the academic hierarchy with a specific combination of intellectual assertiveness and interpersonal deference. Students who grew up in environments where the norms of academic social navigation were ambient, students whose parents were professors or who attended elite preparatory schools with strong mentorship cultures, or who grew up in communities where academic social capital was a primary form of social currency. These students navigate the compliance architecture of the MIT faculty relationship more easily than students who did not grow up in such environments. This is not because they are smarter, it is because the compliance architecture is calibrated to their cultural background. The compliance architecture says you need to secure internships at the right companies. And right does not mean any major technology company. It means the right team within the right company, working on the right kind of project under the right kind of manager. Because the internship is not just a work experience, it is a signal. And the signaling value of an internship varies enormously depending on factors that are never disclosed to the student. Factors like which teams within a company are considered prestigious by the specific hiring managers at the specific companies the student will be applying to after graduation. Navigating this requires a level of inside knowledge that is distributed through the network, through upperclassmen, through alumni, through the informal channels of information that flow through the social infrastructure of the campus. And access to those channels is itself a function of social position within the campus ecosystem. The compliance architecture says you need to participate in the right extracurricular activities, the right hackathons, the right project groups, the right competitive programming events, the right research initiatives, and right is not defined by any official document. It is defined by the patterns of what previous successful students have done, and those patterns are known to students who are embedded in the social networks where that information circulates. I'm laying this out at this level of detail because I need you to understand the full granularity of what Alexandr Wang was navigating when he entered MIT in 2016. He was not just taking classes. He was not just doing homework. He was entering a compliance architecture of extraordinary complexity, granularity, and cultural specificity. An architecture that evaluates on dozens of dimensions simultaneously: academic performance, research aptitude, social navigation, temporal management, emotional resilience, cultural fluency, network density, aesthetic presentation, and that filters with an intensity that leaves almost no margin for error. And here is the point that connects directly to Wang's story. The compliance architecture of MIT is not neutral. It is not culturally agnostic. It is calibrated to the norms of a specific population, the population that has historically dominated the MIT ecosystem. And while that population has diversified over time, the compliance architecture retains the imprint of its historical roots. A student from a small town in New Mexico, even a student from a scientifically sophisticated small town like Los Alamos, enters a compliance architecture that was shaped by decades of students from the Boston suburbs, from the Bay Area, from the feeder schools of the East Coast elite, from families where the norms of elite academic social navigation were part of the air they breathed. And the friction between that student's cultural preparation and the compliance architecture's demands is not a matter of intelligence. It is a matter of calibration. The student may be brilliant, But brilliance that is miscalibrated to the compliance architecture generates friction. And friction, accumulated over semesters, can lead to something that looks like underperformance from the system's perspective, but is, from the structural perspective, simply a mismatch between the individual's cultural preparation and the system's unstated demands. This is how the compliance architecture of an elite institution can expel a talented individual, not through any dramatic failure, not through any overt rejection, but through the slow accumulation of friction, the 1,000 small misalignments between what the individual brings and what the system demands, that eventually makes persistence within the system more costly than departure. And when the individual departs, when they leave or transfer or drop out, the mythology tells a story about that departure that serves the system's interests. If the individual subsequently succeeds, the mythology says they were too brilliant for the system, that the system's constraints could not contain their genius. If the individual does not subsequently succeed, the mythology says they could not cut it, that the system correctly identified their limitations. Either way, the mythology protects the compliance architecture from scrutiny. Either way, the system's invisible filtering mechanism remains hidden. This is the first component of our lens, compliance architecture, the invisible lattice of unstated expectations that determines who persists within a system and who is expelled. Every step of the Alexandr Wang story, from MYT to Quora to Y Combinator to Scale AI to Meta, involves an encounter with a compliance architecture. And at every encounter, the outcome is determined not by Wang's individual capability, but by the alignment or misalignment between his structural position and the specific compliance architecture of the system he is navigating. At MYT, the alignment was insufficient, and he was expelled. At Y Combinator, the alignment was precise, and he was amplified. The individual did not change. The architecture changed. And the architecture is what made the difference. Hold that. Carry it forward, because now we need to add the second component of the lens. We need to talk about precarity, the invisible system of leverage that determines how much freedom any given individual actually has to navigate the architectures they encounter. And precarity, as we will see, is the variable that transforms compliance architecture from an abstract analytical concept into a lived, visceral, materially consequential force that shapes the trajectory of every human life. Now we arrive at the second component of the lens, and this one is perhaps even more invisible than compliance architecture because, at least with compliance architecture, if you are perceptive enough and you spend enough time inside a system, you can begin to feel it pressing against you. You can begin to sense the unstated expectations. You can begin to identify the invisible metrics on which you are being evaluated. The awareness comes slowly, imperfectly, but it comes. With precarity, the awareness often never comes at all, because precarity does not press against you from the outside. Precarity presses against you from the inside. It is embedded in the structure of your life, in your debts, in your obligations, in your dependencies, in the specific configuration of vulnerabilities that determine how much freedom you actually have to make choices, take risks, and deviate from the paths that systems prescribe for you. And because precarity is embedded in the structure of your life rather than imposed by any single institution, it feels natural. It feels like the way things are. It does not feel like a tool, but it is a tool. It is a tool that systems use, consciously or through structural inertia, to maintain leverage over the individuals who move through them. So what is precarity? In the academic literature, precarity refers to a condition of existential insecurity, a state in which the material foundations of your life are unstable, contingent, or vulnerable to disruption in ways that constrain your agency and amplify your dependence on the systems and institutions that provide you with resources. But the way I am going to use the term is more expansive and more structurally specific than the standard academic definition. I'm going to define precarity as the total, multidimensional configuration of vulnerabilities, economic, social, legal, geographical, temporal, relational, medical, informational, and reputational, that collectively determine how much leverage any given system has over you, and therefore how much of your autonomy you are compelled to surrender in exchange for the resources the system provides. This definition is broader because it captures something the standard academic definition misses, that precarity is not a single variable. It is a field. It is a multidimensional field that surrounds every individual and shapes every decision they make, often invisibly, often in ways they cannot articulate even to themselves. And the critical structural insight, the insight that makes precarity a tool rather than merely a condition, is that precarity is not binary. It is not the case that some people are precarious and some people are not. Everyone has a precarity configuration. The billionaire has a precarity configuration. The undocumented worker has a precarity configuration. The tenured professor has a precarity configuration. The first-generation college student has a precarity configuration. The configurations are wildly different in their severity, their texture, their visibility, and their consequences. But they all exist, they all function, and they all operate as invisible leverage that systems use, structurally, not necessarily intentionally, to extract compliance, to enforce containment, and to maintain the power differential between the system and the individual. The difference between the billionaire and the undocumented worker is not that one has precarity and the other does not. The difference is in the architecture of their precarity. How visible it is, how acute it is, how many dimensions it spans, how close to catastrophe it positions the individual, and how much room it leaves for deviation from the system's demands. The billionaire's precarity configuration might include reputational vulnerability, regulatory exposure, the fragility of market valuations, and the social isolation that comes with extreme wealth. These are real forms of precarity, but they are forms of precarity that leave enormous room for maneuver. The billionaire can absorb shocks. The billionaire can pivot. The billionaire can exit systems that are not serving them and enter systems that are. The undocumented worker's precarity configuration, legal vulnerability, financial fragility, geographic constraint, linguistic barriers, social invisibility, leaves almost no room for maneuver. Every decision is constrained. Every choice is bounded by the threat of catastrophic loss. And the systems that the undocumented worker depends upon know this, and they calibrate their compliance architecture accordingly. Let me now make this fully concrete with the level of specificity that the framework demands, because the concrete examples are where the structural analysis becomes viscerally real. Consider two employees at the same technology company. Both are software engineers. Both have roughly equivalent technical skills. Both are compensated at approximately the same level, say $170,000 base salary, plus equity, plus benefits. On paper, on the company's org chart, in the HR system, they are interchangeable. They hold the same title. They are on the same team. They are evaluated by the same manager against the same performance criteria. From the perspective of the stated rules, they are identical, but their precarity configurations are so radically different that they might as well be living in different countries. And the difference in their precarity configurations will determine everything about how they experience the compliance architecture of the company, how much autonomy they have within the system, and how much leverage the system has over them. Employee A is a United States citizen. She grew up in a middle-class household in suburban New Jersey. Her parents are alive, healthy, and live a 2-hour drive from her apartment. She attended a state university on a partial scholarship and graduated with approximately $12,000 in student loan debt, which she paid off within 3 years of starting her career. She has approximately $50,000 in savings. She has a robust professional network, former classmates, former colleagues, industry acquaintances, spread across a dozen technology companies in the region. She is in good health. She has no dependents. Her credit score is excellent. She has received 3 recruiter messages on LinkedIn in the past month from companies offering comparable or better compensation. If employee A is fired tomorrow, the consequences are unpleasant but manageable. She will be upset. She will need to update her resume and start interviewing. She may need to dip into her savings for a month or two, but the foundational structure of her life will not collapse. Her identity will not be threatened. Her legal status will not change. Her housing will not be at risk. Her health insurance will lapse, but she can purchase coverage through the marketplace or through COBRA. She can afford to be selective about her next role. She can afford to take time off. She can afford to say no to offers that do not meet her standards. She has options. And because she has options, the compliance architecture of her current employer exerts less gravitational force on her. She can push back on unreasonable demands. She can advocate for herself. She can set boundaries. And the company knows this. The company knows that she is not desperate. The company knows that if the compliance architecture becomes too demanding, she can leave. And this knowledge, this awareness of her relatively low precarity, shapes how the system treats her. It creates a dynamic equilibrium in which the system's demands and the individual's autonomy are roughly balanced. Now consider employee B. He is an Indian national on an H-1B visa. His employer is his visa sponsor. He arrived in the United States 6 years ago to attend a master's program in computer science at a mid-tier university. He financed the program entirely through student loans, approximately $98,000, because his family in India could not afford to subsidize the cost, and the university did not offer him a full scholarship. After graduating, he applied to over 300 positions before finding one company willing to sponsor his H-1B visa. One company out of 300 applications. He's been at this company for 4 years. If employee B is fired tomorrow, the consequences are not merely unpleasant, they are existential. Under the terms of the H-1B visa, he has 60 days to find another employer willing to sponsor a visa transfer. 60 days. In a labor market where visa sponsorship is increasingly rare, where companies are reluctant to absorb the legal costs and administrative burden of sponsoring a foreign worker, where the pool of available positions that offer sponsorship is a tiny fraction of the total job market. If he does not find a sponsor within 60 days, he must leave the country. He must leave the apartment he has furnished. He must leave the social connections he has built. He must leave the career trajectory he has invested 6 years and $98,000 in constructing. He must return to India, where the job market for someone with his profile is radically different. Lower compensation, different opportunities, different constraints. His student loan debt will not follow him to India, but the financial consequences of his American investment will. The years he spent building a career in the United States will have produced, in the worst case, nothing. And the company knows this. The company does not need to explicitly think about employee B's precarity configuration. The compliance architecture of the workplace automatically calibrates to it, because employee B absorbs more. He works longer hours. He accepts conditions that employee A would refuse. He does not push back on unreasonable demands because the cost of noncompliance, the risk that pushing back will lead to termination, which will lead to deportation, which will lead to the collapse of his entire American life, is too catastrophic to risk. His precarity makes him more compliant, and his compliance makes him more valuable to the system, not because he is more productive, but because he is more governable. The system extracts more from him per unit of compensation than it extracts from employee A. And the delta between what it extracts from him and what it extracts from her is the structural profit of precarity. Now, I need to take this analysis far deeper because the visa example, while vivid, is only the most dramatic illustration of a dynamic that operates at every level of American life in configurations that are far more subtle, far more invisible, and far more consequential than most people recognize. Consider student loan debt. Student loan debt is not typically discussed as a form of structural precarity. It is discussed as a financial obligation, something you took on voluntarily, something you are responsible for repaying, something that is simply a feature of the investment you made in your education. But student loan debt is a precarity instrument of extraordinary power, and its effects extend far beyond the monthly payment in ways that shape career trajectories, geographic mobility, risk tolerance, relationship formation, and wealth accumulation over the course of a lifetime. Student loan debt constrains geographic mobility. If you owe $150,000 from a graduate program, an amount that is not unusual for medical school, law school, MBA programs, or even some undergraduate programs, the range of jobs you can afford to accept narrows dramatically. You cannot take the entry-level position at a promising startup that pays $65,000 a year in San Francisco because the cost of living in San Francisco, minus your loan payments, minus taxes, minus the basic expenses of survival, makes the math non-viable. You would need someone to subsidize you, a parent, a partner, a savings account, and if no one can provide that subsidy, the opportunity is closed, not because you are not qualified, not because you do not want the job, but because your precarity configuration does not permit it. And so you take the corporate job that pays $120,000 in a lower cost of living city because the math works, even if the trajectory is less aligned with where the market is moving. And 5 years later, when the startup has been acquired for $2 billion and the early employees are liquid, you are at the same corporate job, doing the same work, wondering what happened. What happened is precarity. What happened is your debt configuration closed the door to the higher variance, higher return opportunity, and funneled you into the lower variance, lower return path. Not by force, by math. Student loan debt constrains risk tolerance. The single most important financial behavior associated with extreme wealth creation in the American system is risk-taking. Specifically, the willingness to accept a period of reduced or zero income in exchange for equity in a venture with high potential return. Starting a company, joining an early stage startup, pursuing a speculative project, taking a sabbatical to build something, all of these require the ability to survive without stable income for a period of months or years. And if you are servicing $150,000 in student loan debt, the ability to survive without stable income is dramatically reduced. You cannot defer the payments indefinitely. The interest accrues. You cannot miss payments without consequence. Your credit score suffers. Your future borrowing costs increase. Your financial stability erodes. And so the range of professional risks, you can take contracts. You are funneled toward the stable paycheck. You're funneled toward the known quantity. You're funneled toward the path that services the debt. Even if the path that would create the most value for you, for the market, for the world, is the path that requires risk. And here's the structural cruelty. The people who end up on the Forbes list are, almost without exception, people who took enormous professional risks at critical junctures. They dropped out of college. They quit stable jobs. They poured their savings into ventures that had no guarantee of return, and they could take those risks because their precarity configurations permitted it, because they did not have crushing debt, because they had family money or savings or a partner with a stable income or a cultural context in which failure was not catastrophic. The mythology tells you they took risks because they were bold. The architecture tells you they took risks because they could afford to. And the distinction between boldness and affordability is the distinction between the mythology and the truth. Student loan debt constrains wealth accumulation. Every dollar that goes to debt service is a dollar that does not go to savings, to investment, to the compounding engine that produces long-term financial security. The individual who graduates with no debt and invests the equivalent of their hypothetical loan payment in an index fund from age 22 to age 35 will have accumulated a financial cushion that is transformatively different from the financial position of the individual who spent those same years paying down debt. And that cushion, that buffer, is itself a precarity reducer. It reduces the gravitational force of compliance architecture. It creates room for maneuver. It creates the ability to take risks. It creates the foundation for the kind of professional deviation that can produce outsized returns. The absence of that cushion produces the opposite: intensified precarity, increased compliance, reduced autonomy, narrower options. Student loan debt constrains mating selection and partnership formation. This is almost never discussed in the context of economic mobility, but it is structurally significant in ways that compound over a lifetime. Your attractiveness as a long-term partner in a society that evaluates partners partly on financial stability is affected by your debt load. The pool of potential partners willing to merge their financial lives with yours, to combine households, to co-sign mortgages, to plan families, contracts when your debt is high. And because partnerships are themselves a form of structural advantage, a second income, a shared network, a combined set of social and professional connections, a mutual subsidy that allows both partners to take risks they could not take alone, the contraction of your partnership pool has downstream effects on every dimension of your economic trajectory. The debt does not just cost you money, it costs you relationships, and the relationships cost you opportunities, and the opportunities cost you outcomes. The compounding is relentless. Now take this analysis of student loan debt and multiply it across every other dimension of precarity: immigration status, health conditions, disability, family obligations, caregiving responsibilities, geographic constraints, the density or sparsity of your professional network, the prestige or absence of institutional credentials, the timing of your entry into the labor market relative to economic cycles, racial and gender dynamics that shape how systems evaluate you. And you begin to see the full, multidimensional field. Precarity is not a single variable. It is 100 variables, each interacting with the others in ways that produce emergent effects that no single variable could produce alone. And the total configuration, the specific way that all of these variables combine for any given individual at any given moment, is what determines how much leverage the systems around you have over you, how much they can extract from you, how much compliance they can demand, how much deviation they will permit. And now bring this back to the Y Combinator insight, because this is where precarity connects directly to the production of billionaires. Accelerators like Y Combinator occupy a structurally fascinating position in the precarity framework. They are systems that specifically select for a particular configuration of precarity. They want founders who are talented enough to build something of value, but precarious enough that Y Combinator's resources, the seed funding, the network access, the mentorship, the demo day platform, represent a genuine inflection point. If you are already wealthy, already connected, already positioned to build a successful company without Y Combinator, then Y Combinator's value proposition to you is diminished. And by extension, Y Combinator's leverage over you is diminished. The ideal Y Combinator founder from the system's structural perspective is someone who is talented and precarious, someone who has been expelled from or has failed to gain entry to the traditional pipelines of elite career advancement, and who sees Y Combinator as their best remaining path to an outsized outcome. And as we will see in the sections that follow, both Alexandr Wang and Lucy Guo fit this profile with remarkable structural precision. Both were talented, both were credentialed, but both were also precarious in ways that were invisible to anyone looking at their resumes, but profoundly legible to the systems that selected them. And their precarity, the specific configuration of it, the way it closed certain doors and opened others, the way it created urgency and eliminated alternatives, was not incidental to their success. It was structurally constitutive of it. Without the precarity, the architecture would not have functioned. Without the precarity, the outcome would not have been produced. That is the second component of the lens. Compliance architecture tells you how systems filter. Precarity tells you why individuals comply. Together, they explain the mechanics of institutional power, the mechanics that determine who advances, who stagnates, and who is expelled. And now we need the third component, the component that explains what happens after expulsion, the component that explains how someone who has been pushed out of one system can end up, paradoxically, in a better position than someone who stayed in. That component is resolution arbitrage. And resolution arbitrage is where the story of Alexandr Wang truly begins. Resolution arbitrage. This is a term I have coined to describe a phenomenon that is hiding in plain sight across every domain of American economic and professional life, yet is almost never named, almost never taught, almost never consciously articulated in any career advice, any business school curriculum, any mentorship conversation. And the reason it is never named is not that it is obscure or academic. The reason it is never named is that naming it would undermine the mythology of individual transcendence, because resolution arbitrage reveals that the difference between a marginal outcome and an extraordinary outcome is often not a difference in the individual at all. It is a difference in the system. And if the system is what makes the difference, then the mythology that says the individual is what makes the difference collapses. Here is the concept in its most precise form. Every system, every pipeline, every career track, every institutional environment, every market operates at a specific resolution. By resolution, I mean the level of granularity at which the system evaluates the individuals within it, differentiates between those individuals, and allocates outcomes based on those differentiations. Resolution is not a metaphor. It is a structurally determinative property of the system that shapes, with mathematical precision, who succeeds and who does not. In a high-resolution system, like the computer science program at MIT, or the partner track at a top-tier law firm, or the competitive hiring pipeline at Google's DeepMind division, the system evaluates individuals on dozens of dimensions simultaneously, with extreme granularity. It sees you clearly. It can distinguish between the 93rd percentile and the 97th percentile along multiple axes. It can differentiate between someone who is very good and someone who is exceptional. And because it can see these differences, it allocates outcomes based on them. The person at the 97th percentile gets the research assistantship, the top-tier internship, the recommendation letter from the famous professor. The person at the 93rd percentile does not. The difference between them may be objectively tiny, a fraction of a grade point, a slightly less impressive project, a marginally less dense network of faculty relationships, but the system can see the difference, and the system acts on the difference. In a low-resolution system, like a venture capital pitch meeting, or a startup ecosystem that evaluates founders based on biographical narratives rather than granular performance metrics, or a new market where the established players have not yet developed the tools to differentiate between competitors, the system cannot see those differences. It evaluates individuals on a coarser set of criteria. Did you attend an elite institution? Yes or no. Do you have technical credentials? Yes or no. Have you been validated by a respected system? Y Combinator, Thiel Fellowship, a major employer? Yes or no. Do you present well? Yes or no. These are binary or near binary evaluations. They do not differentiate between the 93rd percentile and the 97th percentile. They do not differentiate between the person who almost made the cut at MIT and the person who thrived at MIT. They evaluate at a resolution where both of those individuals, the almost and the thrived, appear essentially identical. This is resolution arbitrage. It is the act of moving from a system where your capabilities place you below the threshold for success to a system where the same capabilities place you above it, not because your capabilities changed, but because the system's resolution changed. The same individual with the same skills, the same intelligence, the same work ethic, the same credentials can be a marginal performer in one system and a dominant performer in another, purely as a function of the system's ability to differentiate between them and their peers. Now, I need to go deeper into the mechanics of why this works, because the concept as stated might seem trivially obvious. Of course, it is easier to succeed in a less competitive environment. But that framing, while partially correct, fundamentally misses the mechanism. Resolution arbitrage is not about finding an easier environment. It is about finding an environment where the specific configuration of your structural advantages is disproportionately valued relative to its value in the original environment. This is a subtler and far more powerful insight. Let me illustrate with maximum precision. Consider two individuals who are both at the 93rd percentile of the MIT computer science program. They are both very good, they are both intelligent, they are both technically capable, but they are not in the top 5% of the program. And in a system that is calibrated to differentiate between the top 5% and everyone else, they are below the threshold for the most desirable outcomes. The research positions, the elite internships, the faculty recommendations that open the doors to the most prestigious career trajectories. Now, consider what happens when these two individuals leave MIT and enter two different systems. Individual A enters the hiring pipeline of a major technology company, say Meta or Google. In this system, the resolution is still relatively high. The hiring pipeline at a major technology company has been refined over decades to differentiate between strong candidates and exceptional candidates. It uses multiple rounds of technical interviews, behavioral assessments, reference checks, and internal calibration sessions to evaluate applicants with considerable granularity. Individual A, who is at the 93rd percentile at MIT, will be evaluated in this system as a strong but not exceptional candidate. They will likely be hired. They will likely receive a competitive compensation package. But they will enter the system at a level that reflects their position in the distribution, solidly above average, but not in the top tier. And their trajectory within the company will be shaped by the company's internal compliance architecture, which will evaluate them with the same granularity that the hiring pipeline did. Individual B, however, enters a different system. Individual B enters the startup ecosystem, specifically the Y Combinator pipeline. In this system, the resolution is radically different. Y Combinator does not evaluate individual B on the same dimensions that MIT evaluated them, and it does not evaluate at the same resolution. Y Combinator evaluates on a much coarser set of criteria. Does this person have elite credentials? Yes, they attended MIT. Are they technically capable? Yes. They have a background in computer science. Have they demonstrated risk tolerance? Yes. They left MIT. Do they have a compelling narrative? Yes. MIT dropout building something in AI. These evaluations are coarse. They do not differentiate between the 93rd percentile MIT student and the 99th percentile MIT student. At Y Combinator's resolution, both are MIT-trained technical founders, and that designation carries the same weight regardless of where the individual sat within the MIT distribution. And here is the extraordinary thing. In the Y Combinator system, individual B's coarsely evaluated credentials place them at or near the top of the distribution. Because the Y Combinator applicant pool, while talented, is not composed exclusively of MIT graduates. It includes founders from less prestigious institutions, founders without technical backgrounds, founders from outside the United States. In this pool, an MIT dropout with technical skills and a compelling narrative is not a marginal performer. They are a standout. The system cannot see that they were at the 93rd percentile at MIT. The system can only see that they were at MIT. And at the resolution where was at MIT is the relevant criterion, the 93rd percentile individual and the 99th percentile individual are indistinguishable. This means that individual B, who was below the threshold for the most desirable outcomes in the high-resolution MIT system, is above the threshold for the most desirable outcomes in the lower-resolution Y Combinator system. The same person, the same capabilities, the same credentials, different system, different resolution, different outcome, and the outcome in the lower resolution system is not merely adequate. It can be extraordinary, because the Y Combinator system does not just evaluate, it amplifies. It takes the coarsely evaluated credentials of the founders it admits and feeds them through a narrative manufacturing machine that produces a product, a fundable startup with a legible founding story that can attract millions of dollars in venture capital investment. And the venture capital market evaluates at an even lower resolution than Y Combinator. The venture capitalist, writing a check at a demo day event, is evaluating on the coarsest possible criteria. Is this team legible? Is this narrative compelling? Does this fit the pattern of previous successful investments? At that resolution, the 93rd percentile MIT student who was expelled from the traditional pipeline is functionally identical to the 99th percentile MIT student who chose to leave. Both are MIT-trained founders. Both are investable. Both receive checks. And this is the mechanism that produces the paradox that sits at the heart of the Alexandr Wang story. The individual who was below the threshold in the high-resolution system is placed, through the mechanism of resolution arbitrage, into a position where the returns available to them exceed the returns that would have been available to them had they stayed in the high-resolution system and succeeded. Let me say that again, because it is the most counterintuitive and most structurally significant insight in this entire commentary. The dropout who enters the alternative pipeline and builds a billion-dollar company has achieved an outcome that is categorically beyond what the traditional pipeline could have produced for them, even if they had performed at the 99th percentile within that pipeline. The MIT graduate who joins Google and climbs the corporate ladder to the level of VP of engineering, which is arguably the best-case scenario for the traditional pipeline, will achieve a total lifetime compensation that is a tiny fraction of the wealth that the dropout who founded Scale AI accumulated through the alternative pipeline. The alternative path outperformed the traditional path, not because the dropout was more talented than the person who stayed, but because the alternative path happened to intersect with a set of structural forces, the AI wave, the venture capital market, the government contract pipeline, the meta acquisition, that amplified the dropout's coarsely evaluated credentials into an outcome that the traditional path's high-resolution evaluation could never have produced. This is resolution arbitrage in its fullest expression. And it is not random, it is not luck. It has a specific structural logic. The individuals who are most likely to successfully execute resolution arbitrage are those who occupy a very specific position within the original system, a position I call the overflow zone. The overflow zone is the region just below the threshold of success in a highly competitive pipeline. It is the 88th to 95th percentile, close enough to the top to have absorbed the credentials, the knowledge, the network exposure, the pattern recognition, the institutional branding that the system confers upon its participants, but not quite close enough to clear the system's increasingly narrow final filter. These individuals are, from the system's perspective, waste product. They are the ones who did not make the cut. They are expelled, discarded, filtered out. But from the perspective of the adjacent systems that can absorb them, they are extraordinarily valuable. They carry the signaling power of the elite system. They carry the training, they carry the credentials, and they are available because the elite system no longer wants them. The adjacent system can acquire them at a discount, and the adjacent system, operating at a lower resolution, cannot see the reasons the elite system expelled them. all it can see is the branding. Overflow zone individuals are the raw material that alternative pipelines like Y Combinator, the Thiel Fellowship, and the broader startup ecosystem are designed to process. These systems exist specifically to capture the overflow from elite academic and corporate pipelines and convert that overflow into entrepreneurial outcomes that generate returns for investors. They are not charitable organizations, they are machines. And the fuel they run on is overflow zone individuals whose precarity configurations make them available, whose credentials make them legible, and whose structural positions make them optimal for the specific kind of amplification that the alternative pipeline provides. And this is precisely what happened with Alexandr Wang and Lucy Guo. Both were overflow zone individuals. Both had been expelled from, or had exited, the traditional elite pipeline. Wang from MIT, Guo from Carnegie Mellon. Both carried the branding of those institutions without having completed the credentialing process. Both were in a state of elevated precarity. The traditional path was closed or closing behind them, and the alternative path was the most viable option remaining. And both were absorbed by the Y Combinator system at a moment when the alternative pipeline was positioned to generate extraordinary returns. Returns that would be amplified by the temporal alignment with the AI wave, the network architecture of Silicon Valley, and the geopolitical forces that were creating unprecedented demand for AI infrastructure. The architecture produced the outcome. Resolution arbitrage was the mechanism, and the mythology of individual transcendence was the curtain that kept the mechanism hidden. But the curtain is coming down now. We have built the lens, compliance architecture, precarity, and resolution arbitrage, and we are ready to apply it to the specific, granular, hyper-technical reality of Alexandr Wang's trajectory. Starting with the place where it all begins, a small town on a mesa in northern New Mexico, built by the federal government to house the scientists who built the atomic bomb. Starting with Los Alamos. Now let us begin the biography. But we are going to tell it differently from how it has ever been told. We are not going to tell it as a story of a prodigy. We are going to tell it as a story of a structural position. And the structural position begins not with Alexandr Wang, but with the place where he was born and the people who brought him into the world. Because the single most important variable in any person's life trajectory, the variable that determines more about their future than any decision they will ever make, more than any talent they will ever develop, more than any effort they will ever expend, is the structural position they inherit at birth. And the structural position Alexandr Wang inherited at birth was extraordinary. Not in the way the mythology frames it, not as the inherited genius of brilliant parents, but in a far more specific, far more granular, far more structurally determinative way. Alexandr Wang was born in 1997 in Los Alamos, New Mexico. If that location does not immediately register as structurally significant, you are missing something that is absolutely essential to understanding everything that follows. Los Alamos is not a normal town. Los Alamos is, by any meaningful measure, one of the most structurally anomalous communities in the United States. It is a town that was literally created by the federal government in 1943 for the purpose of housing the scientists and engineers of the Manhattan Project, the research program that developed the first atomic weapons. The town was built on a remote mesa in the Jemez Mountains of northern New Mexico, specifically because its geographical isolation made it suitable for classified research. For decades after the war, Los Alamos remained a government-operated community whose entire economic, social, and institutional infrastructure was organized around a single employer, the Los Alamos National Laboratory, one of the most elite scientific research institutions on the planet. Let me be specific about what this means in structural terms, because the specificity is where the power of this analysis lives. Los Alamos County has a median household income that is among the highest in the state of New Mexico, approximately $120,000 compared to a state median of roughly $52,000. But more significant than the income is the educational attainment. Los Alamos has one of the highest concentrations of PhDs per capita of any community in the United States. The adults in the community are not just employed, they are employed at the apex of American scientific achievement. They are physicists, chemists, engineers, computer scientists, mathematicians, material scientists, and nuclear weapons designers. The local school system is funded and supported by a tax base of these individuals, a tax base that produces per-pupil spending levels that far exceed the state average and that supports enrichment programs, advanced coursework, and educational resources that are unavailable in the vast majority of American communities. The cultural norms of Los Alamos are the norms of the laboratory. Curiosity is normal. Quantitative reasoning is normal. Abstract thinking is normal. Discussion of scientific concepts at the dinner table is normal. The expectation that children will pursue advanced education is not just normal. It is ambient. It is the default assumption. In most American communities, a child who shows an interest in mathematics or competitive programming is unusual, an outlier who may or may not receive support and encouragement. In Los Alamos, that child is the median. The community is structured to identify, support, and channel technically gifted children into the pipelines that lead to elite universities and high-level technical careers. This is not an accident. This is the community operating exactly as it was designed, as a feeder system for the American scientific and technical establishment. Now consider Wang's parents, specifically. Both of Wang's parents were Chinese immigrants who worked as physicists, and the specific detail of their employment is critical. They were physicists at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. This is not equivalent to being a physicist at a university or physicist at a private research company, or a physicist in the general sense. Being a physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory means you have been vetted by the United States government for access to some of the most sensitive classified research programs in the country. It means you hold a security clearance, likely at the Q or L level, the Department of Energy's equivalents of top secret and secret. It means you have navigated an immigration and employment process that is extraordinarily selective. It means you have a terminal degree, a PhD, from a competitive institution. It means you are embedded in a professional network of scientists who are among the most accomplished in their fields, working on problems that range from nuclear weapons maintenance to climate modeling to computational physics to national security applications of artificial intelligence. The structural implications of this parental background cascade through every dimension of Wang's early life, and I'm going to trace them with the granularity they deserve, because each one is a thread in the architecture that produced the outcome on the Forbes list. Implication 1. Cognitive environment. Growing up in the household of two physicists at a national laboratory creates a cognitive environment that is qualitatively different from what the vast majority of American children experience. The conversations that happen in that household about research, about mathematics, about scientific methodology, about the nature of complex systems, are not supplements to the child's education. They are the foundation of the child's cognitive development. Before the child ever enters a classroom, they have been immersed in a pattern of thinking that is analytical, quantitative, and comfortable with abstraction. They have been exposed to the language of science, not the popularized, simplified version, but the actual technical language that researchers use among themselves. This exposure does not guarantee mathematical talent, but it dramatically increases the probability that mathematical talent, if present, will be identified early, nurtured effectively, and channeled toward the competitions and programs that build the resume of a future MIT applicant. Implication 2. Immigration stability. Wang's parents were Chinese immigrants who had successfully navigated the American immigration system to secure positions at a federal research laboratory with security clearance requirements. This means their immigration status was fully settled. They were almost certainly permanent residents or naturalized citizens by the time Wang was born. This means that Alexandr Wang grew up as a United States citizen with no immigration-related precarity whatsoever. He did not face the constraints that many children of immigrants face: the uncertainty of parental visa status, the fear of deportation, the limitations on financial aid and employment that affect undocumented or temporarily documented individuals. His parents' successful navigation of the immigration system meant that he inherited a level of legal and bureaucratic stability that is invisible when you are inside it, but catastrophically absent when you are not. Implication 3. Financial buffer. Two physicists at a national laboratory in a low cost of living area of New Mexico constitute a solidly upper middle class household. This means resources for enrichment, math tutoring, competition registration fees, travel to national level competitions, computer equipment, books, educational software. It means the ability to finance extracurricular activities that are prerequisites for the kind of resume that gets a student admitted to MIT. It means a financial safety net that permits risk-taking. The ability, later in Wang's trajectory, to take a gap year before MIT, to work at Quora in Silicon Valley, and ultimately to drop out of MIT and participate in Y Combinator, without the existential financial consequences that would have made such decisions impossible for someone from a more precarious background. The financial buffer does not just provide comfort, it provides optionality. It provides the structural ability to deviate from the default path when the default path is not working, without the deviation being catastrophic. Implication 4. Cultural script transmission. Wang's parents were not just immigrants. They were highly educated immigrants who had successfully integrated into one of the most elite professional communities in America. This means they understood the American educational system at a level of sophistication that most families, immigrant or native born, do not possess. They understood the significance of specific competitions. They understood the college admissions process. They understood that MIT was not just a good school, but a specific pipeline that led to specific outcomes. And this understanding was transmitted to Wang not as explicit instruction, but as ambient knowledge, the way water is transmitted to a fish. He grew up inside a model of the world that included MIT, that included STEM careers, that included the specific sequence of steps required to move from childhood mathematical aptitude to elite institutional placement. But, and this is the critical structural twist that connects the Los Alamos origin story to the MIT departure story, the cultural script that Wang's parents transmitted was a script that was optimized for a specific version of the American economic system. A version that existed when the parents navigated it in the 1980s and 90s. A version in which the path from elite technical education to high-status employment was relatively linear, relatively reliable, and relatively free of the hyper-competitive dynamics that would characterize the same path a generation later. The parents' script said, get into a top school, get a technical degree, get a job at a major employer, build stability, build wealth. This script worked for their generation. It worked for their colleagues at Los Alamos. And so it was transmitted to their child with full conviction as the default path, the path of maximum reliability. But the system the script was optimized for had changed by the time Wang reached the critical junctures. The pipelines had narrowed, the competition had intensified, the number of individuals pursuing the same path had increased dramatically, and the returns to following the script, while still positive, were no longer as reliably exceptional as they had been when the script was written. The script got Wang to MIT, but the script could not guarantee that MIT's compliance architecture would be navigable with the specific preparation that the script provided. And when the compliance architecture generated friction, as we will examine in the next section, the script had no contingency for deviation. The script said, stay on the path. The architecture said, the path is rejecting you. And the space between those two messages is the space where the Alexandr Wang story actually begins. This is the inheritance nobody discusses. Not genetic inheritance, although the cognitive advantages conferred by two physicist parents are real and significant. Not financial inheritance, although the upper middle class stability of the Los Alamos household is a structurally necessary condition for everything that followed. The inheritance that nobody discusses is the structural inheritance, the total configuration of geographic, cultural, educational, financial, legal, and informational advantages that Wang did not earn, did not choose, and could not have produced through any amount of individual effort. An inheritance that was conferred upon him at birth by the accident of being born to specific parents in a specific place at a specific time. And an inheritance that made every subsequent step of his trajectory, from math counts to MIT to Quora to Y Combinator to Scale AI to Meta, structurally possible in a way that it would not have been possible for the vast majority of individuals, regardless of their individual capabilities. The architecture begins here, in a small town on a mesa, in a household where physics was ordinary and MIT was the expected destination, in a structural position so laden with invisible advantage that the mythology could later frame the outcome as the product of pure individual brilliance, because the advantage was invisible, and the mythology's power lies precisely in what it makes invisible. The critical inflection point in the structural story of Alexandr Wang is the period during which he attended and subsequently left the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the way this period is narrated in every profile, every interview, every media article about Wang is, by the standards of structural analysis, almost entirely wrong. Not factually wrong, the facts are generally accurate, but wrong in the causal framework it applies to the facts, wrong in the explanation it offers for why Wang left, wrong in the implications it draws from his departure, and wrong in a way that is specifically designed by the gravitational pull of narrative convention, not by any conscious intent, to reinforce the mythology of individual transcendence. The standard narrative says, Wang was so brilliant, so entrepreneurially driven, so far ahead of his peers, that the constraints of formal education could not contain him. He dropped out of MIT to start a company. The dropout became a billionaire. The subtext is clear. MIT was too small for him. He transcended the system. He is the exception that proves the rule, proof that true genius cannot be contained by institutional structures. The structural analysis tells a different story, a story that is more complex, more revealing, and more useful than the mythology. To understand the structural story, we need to understand what MIT actually is, not as a brand, not as a cultural symbol, not as a bullet point on a resume, but as a system, a compliance architecture, a selection mechanism, a pipeline that processes human beings with the precision and ruthlessness of an industrial machine. MIT's computer science program is one of the most competitive academic environments on Earth. The students who enter it are not merely intelligent, they are the surviving output of a prior filtering cascade that has already eliminated the vast majority of their age cohort. They were filtered in elementary school when standardized tests and teacher evaluations identified them as gifted. They were filtered in middle school when math competitions like math counts separated the quantitatively talented from the merely bright. They were filtered in high school when the USA Computing Olympiad, advanced placement coursework, selective summer programs, and the college admissions process itself sorted them into the microscopically thin top of the distribution. By the time a student arrives at MIT to study computer science, they have been filtered through at least a decade of increasingly stringent selection mechanisms. They are not normal students. They are the product of one of the most aggressive, most sustained, most resource-intensive talent identification and talent sorting systems in human history. And then the real filtering begins. because the MIT computer science pipeline does not merely admit talented students and allow them to develop at their own pace. The pipeline compresses. It takes the top fraction of a percent of the American student population and forces them into an environment where the competitive density is orders of magnitude higher than anything they have previously experienced. In high school, the gifted student was the best in their class, or the best in their school, or the best in their region. At MIT, they are surrounded by people who are also the best in their class, in their school, in their region. The reference frame shifts radically. The student who was at the 99th percentile of their high school is now at the 50th percentile of MIT. And the psychological, emotional, and practical consequences of that shift are enormous. The coursework is designed to push students to the edge of their cognitive capacity. The problem sets are legendarily long and difficult, not as an accidental byproduct of rigorous curriculum design, but as a deliberate feature of the compliance architecture. The difficulty serves multiple functions. It filters. Students who cannot maintain the pace are identified and eventually exit the system, either by switching to less demanding majors or by leaving the institution entirely. It sorts. Students who can maintain the pace, but at different levels of performance, are sorted into a finely differentiated ranking that determines their access to the most desirable research positions, internships, and post-graduation opportunities. And it trains. The students who thrive under the pressure absorb a pattern of cognitive endurance, problem-solving under constraint, and comfort with intellectual discomfort that the system considers essential. But the coursework is only one dimension of the compliance architecture. The MIT computer science ecosystem is a comprehensive system that extends far beyond the classroom, and the dimensions that extend beyond the classroom are, in many ways, more consequential for a student's trajectory than their academic performance. You must secure the right research position. And the process of securing a research position is not a straightforward application process. It is a social negotiation that requires building a relationship with a specific faculty member whose research aligns with your interests and who is willing to invest their limited supervisory bandwidth in you. This requires attending the right office hours, asking the right questions, demonstrating the right kind of intellectual engagement, not too broad, not too narrow, enthusiastic but not obsequious, assertive but not presumptuous. It requires cultural fluency in the specific norms of academic interaction that vary from professor to professor, from lab to lab, from department to department. Students who grew up in academic households, who attended schools with strong research mentorship cultures, who have prior exposure to the social dynamics of intellectual communities, navigate this process more easily. Students who did not grow up in such environments face a learning curve that the system does not acknowledge and does not accommodate. You must secure the right internships. At the MIT level, the right internship is not just any position at a technology company. It is a position at a specific company, on a specific team, doing specific work that signals a specific level of competence to the specific audiences, graduate admissions committees, future employers, venture capital investors, who will evaluate you next. And the process of identifying which internships are right, which carry the most signaling power, which open the most doors, requires access to information that is not publicly available. It circulates through networks, through upperclassmen who interned at the company last summer, through alumni who work at the company and can provide inside information about which teams are prestigious and which are not, through the informal social infrastructure of the MIT campus, the study groups, the clubs, the parties, the late-night conversations in common rooms, where this information is exchanged. You must maintain a GPA that positions you competitively. At MIT, grades are distributed on a 5-point scale, and the difference between a 4.5 and a 4.8, a difference that would be invisible in almost any other context, can determine whether a student is competitive for the most selective opportunities. And you must do all of this within the temporal constraints of the system: the semester schedule, the problem set deadlines, the internship application timelines, the research presentation dates, constraints that do not adjust to the individual's needs, rhythms, or circumstances. The system sets the clock. The individual must conform to the clock. And if the individual's cognitive rhythms, personal circumstances, or cultural preparation create friction with the clock's demands, the friction is the individual's problem. Now here is the structural point. Wang entered this system from Los Alamos, New Mexico. He was intellectually prepared, he had won math competitions, he had competed in the USA Computing Olympiad, he was quantitatively gifted. By the stated admissions criteria, he was well qualified. But the compliance architecture of the MYTCS ecosystem evaluates on dimensions that go far beyond what the admissions criteria measure. And some of those dimensions, the social navigation, the cultural fluency, the network building, the intuitive understanding of which opportunities are right and how to position yourself to access them, are dimensions where a student from a small, geographically isolated scientific community in New Mexico may face structural disadvantages relative to students who grew up embedded in the feeder networks of the MIT ecosystem. I'm not claiming to know the specific reasons Wang left MIT. The public record says he spent about a year there before leaving. Some accounts mention that he also worked briefly at Hudson River Trading, a high-frequency trading firm, which itself is an interesting structural data point, as HFT firms recruit from a very specific subset of quantitatively gifted MIT students, and the work is known for its extreme intensity. But whatever the specific precipitating factors, the structural analysis does not require us to know them. The structural analysis says the compliance architecture of the MIT pipeline generated sufficient friction with Wang's specific structural position that he exited the system. He did not transfer, he did not switch to a less demanding major, he left. And in leaving, he entered the overflow zone, the structurally liminal space between the pipeline that expelled him and the alternative pipelines that would eventually absorb him. And in the overflow zone, he went to Quora, where he met Lucy Guo, and the architecture of Scale AI began to crystallize. To understand the founding of Scale AI as a structural event, rather than a biographical anecdote, we must examine Lucy Guo's trajectory with the same analytical rigor we have applied to Wang's, because her path through the architecture illuminates dimensions that Wang's path alone does not reveal. If Wang's story is the story of overflow from the MIT pipeline, Guo's story is the story of overflow from the Carnegie Mellon pipeline, rerouted through one of the most explicitly constructed resolution arbitrage mechanisms in Silicon Valley, the Thiel Fellowship, and the convergence of their two overflow trajectories at Quora, the convergence that made Scale AI structurally possible, is not a coincidence. It is an architectural inevitability. It is what happens when two talented, credentialed, precarious individuals are absorbed by the same catchment system at the same structural moment. Lucy Guo was born in 1994 in Fremont, California. Fremont sits in the southern portion of the San Francisco Bay Area. It is not Palo Alto. It is not the epicenter of venture capital wealth. But it is inside the gravitational field of the technology ecosystem, close enough that the ambient culture of the community reflects the norms, the values, and the aspirations of the tech industry. Guo's parents were Chinese immigrants who worked as electrical engineers. The structural parallel with Wang's parents is not coincidental. It reflects a specific historical pattern of Chinese professional immigration to the United States that produced a generation of technically trained immigrant families concentrated in communities with high density of technology employment. Guo demonstrated technical aptitude early. She began coding in elementary school. She built websites by 6th grade. As a teenager, she developed automated bots for the online game Neopets and monetized in-game assets, reportedly earning 5-figure revenues from internet marketing during high school. These details are typically cited as evidence of entrepreneurial genius, and they are evidence of precociousness, but they are also evidence of structural position. A child who codes in elementary school is a child with access to computers, internet, and at least one parent who models or supports technical engagement. A teenager who monetizes digital assets is a teenager embedded in an information environment where such opportunities are legible, where the concept of making money online is not exotic but proximate. Guo enrolled at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, studying computer science and human-computer interaction. Carnegie Mellon's CS program is consistently ranked among the top 3 in the world, alongside MIT and Stanford. It functions as the same kind of pipeline, a selection mechanism that sorts, compresses, and filters students through progressively narrow opportunities. And like MIT, its compliance architecture extends beyond academics into research, internships, social dynamics, and cultural navigation. But Guo did not complete the Carnegie Mellon pipeline. In 2014, during her senior year, she was selected as a Thiel Fellow. The Thiel Fellowship, created by PayPal co-founder and billionaire venture capitalist Peter Thiel in 2011, awards $100,000, later increased to $200,000, to young people under 22 who agree to leave or forego college to pursue entrepreneurial projects. The fellowship selects approximately 20 to 25 fellows per year from a large applicant pool. It is explicitly designed as an alternative to the traditional educational pipeline. The Thiel Fellowship is, in structural terms, one of the purest resolution arbitrage mechanisms in existence. It identifies overflow zone individuals from elite institutions and provides them with 3 things: capital, network, and social permission. The capital, $100,000, is meaningful but not transformative on its own. The network, the Thiel Fellowship alumni community, which includes the founders of companies like Ethereum, Figma, and now Scale AI, is substantially more valuable. But the most valuable thing the fellowship provides is social permission. It gives the individual permission to deviate from the traditional pipeline without shame. It reframes the deviation from dropout to Thiel Fellow, from someone who could not finish college to someone who was selected by Peter Thiel as too talented for college. This reframing is not cosmetic. It is structurally transformative. It changes how the venture capital ecosystem evaluates the individual. It changes how investors pattern match. It converts a potential liability, the absence of a degree, into an asset. Because in the venture capital ecosystem, the Thiel Fellowship signals a very specific set of traits that investors have learned to associate with entrepreneurial success: unconventionality, risk tolerance, the willingness to deviate from prescribed paths, and the implicit endorsement of one of the most successful and most iconoclastic investors in Silicon Valley history. After the Thiel Fellowship, Guo moved through a sequence of positions that progressively deepened her embeddedness in the Silicon Valley ecosystem. She interned at Facebook. She worked at Snapchat as a product designer, reportedly the company's first female designer, contributing to the development of Snap Maps. She then moved to Quora. Each position added layers of structural advantage, network connections, industry knowledge, cultural fluency in the norms of Silicon Valley startups, and the kind of resume that reads as insider to the pattern-matching algorithms of venture capital evaluation. And it was at Quora that she met Wang. The structural significance of this convergence cannot be overstated. Two overflow zone individuals, both Chinese-American, both the children of Chinese immigrant technical professionals, both had been on the traditional elite academic pipeline, and both had exited. Both were in the liminal space of elevated precarity and residual prestige, carrying the branding of their elite institutions without the completed credential. Both were embedded in the same system, the Silicon Valley startup ecosystem, at the same moment in time. Their convergence was architecturally produced. The Silicon Valley startup ecosystem functions as a catchment basin for overflow from elite academic pipelines. The Bay Area is dense with individuals who followed precisely this trajectory, entered an elite program, exited before completion, gravitated toward the startup ecosystem because it is the most visible and most culturally validated alternative for technically trained individuals who are no longer on the traditional path. Quora, as a mid-sized Silicon Valley technology company with a culture of hiring talented engineers regardless of degree completion, was a natural absorption point for both Wang and Guo. Their meeting was not destiny. It was the predictable consequence of two architecturally similar overflow trajectories converging at the same structural node. And when they converged, when two people whose biographical profiles were complementary, whose combined credentials created a narrative package of extraordinary legibility, and whose shared precarity created urgency, the probability of a co-founding event increased dramatically, not because they had a brilliant idea, not because they experienced a moment of entrepreneurial revelation, but because the structural conditions made co-founding the most legible, most accessible, most rational path forward from their shared position. The alternative, staying at Quora, working as employees, building someone else's company, was viable but bounded. It would have produced comfortable careers. It would not have produced a Forbes listing. The co-founding path, routed through Y Combinator, offered the possibility of resolution arbitrage on a massive scale. And both of them, whether consciously or intuitively, recognized that the alternative pipeline was where their structural advantages would generate the highest return. Y Combinators. Summer 2016 batch. This is where the Scale AI story enters the domain of the institutional machine, and understanding what Y Combinator actually is as a structural mechanism, rather than as the benevolent mentor figure the public narrative presents, is essential to understanding how two Quora employees became the founders of a multi-billion-dollar AI infrastructure company. The public narrative of Y Combinator is straightforward and appealing. Y Combinator identifies promising early-stage startups, invests a small amount of capital, provides 3 months of intensive mentorship, and then showcases the companies at Demo Day, where they pitch to hundreds of investors. The narrative frames Y Combinator as a talent identification engine, a system that finds diamonds in the rough and gives them the resources to shine. The structural reality is more specific and more mechanistic. Y Combinator is a narrative manufacturing engine. Its primary operational function is to take individuals with specific structural profiles, the right combination of credentials, precarity, technical capability, and biographical legibility, and convert those profiles into narrative products that the venture capital market is designed to consume. Y Combinator does not primarily identify great founders in the way a talent scout identifies great athletes. Y Combinator primarily constructs the framing around founders in a way that makes them investable. The distinction is critical. Identification implies that the quality pre-exists and is merely discovered. Construction implies that the quality is, at least in part, manufactured by the system, assembled from the raw material of the founder's structural position and shaped into a form that activates the pattern-matching heuristics of venture capital investors. How does the machine work? Y Combinator operates in batches. Each batch admits several hundred companies. The admission process evaluates applicants on a set of criteria that are not what most outsiders imagine. Y Combinator is not primarily looking for great ideas. Y Combinator's own partners have said publicly that the idea a company enters YC with is frequently not the idea the company leaves with. The admission process is primarily evaluating the founders. Specifically, it is evaluating the founders' structural profiles against a set of templates that Y Combinator has developed over 2 decades of operation from the observed patterns of successful and unsuccessful companies. The templates favor certain structural profiles, elite credentials, MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Harvard, or equivalent. These credentials are legible to investors and signal cognitive capability, technical competence, the ability to build the product, not just pitch it. This reduces execution risk in the investor's assessment. Departure from the traditional pipeline, dropout status, unconventional career path, or other deviation from the expected trajectory. This signals risk tolerance and the specific kind of urgency that Y Combinator's compliance architecture is designed to exploit. And precarity, a structural position in which the Y Combinator program represents a genuine inflection point. Founders who are already wealthy or well-connected are less desirable because Y Combinator's resources are less transformative for them, and Y Combinator's leverage over them is correspondingly less. Wang and Guo matched this template precisely. MIT plus Carnegie Mellon, both technical, both dropouts, both precarious. The application was almost certainly a strong match from Y Combinator's perspective, not because the idea was compelling, it would change multiple times, but because the founders' structural profiles were optimal for the manufacturing process. Once admitted, the batch process begins. And the batch process is a compression engine. It takes 3 months of calendar time and compresses into it the iterative, market testing, pivot executing, narrative refining work that might take an independent startup a year or more. The compression is enforced by Y Combinator's own compliance architecture. Weekly check-ins with a designated YC partner, regular group meetings, milestone expectations, and the looming deadline of demo day, which creates a temporal urgency that drives rapid iteration. In the case of Scale AI, the batch process produced multiple pivots. The company entered YC with an initial concept that was reportedly an API for human tasks, a general-purpose platform for outsourcing work that required human intelligence. This concept was too broad to be investable. During the batch, the team observed that multiple other companies in the cohort were building chatbot-related products that required large amounts of training data. This observation, which was a product of the Y Combinator environment, not of individual foresight, led to a pivot toward providing data labeling services for AI applications. The team bought the domain scaleapi.com, built a landing page, and launched on Product Hunt within 3 days. The rapid execution was driven by the compression engine, by the temporal urgency of the demo day deadline, and the knowledge that they needed a legible, demonstrable value proposition before the clock ran out. After the initial launch, a further refinement occurred. The most immediate and lucrative market for data labeling was autonomous vehicles. Self-driving car companies needed enormous volumes of labeled sensor data and were willing to pay for it. Scale AI narrowed its focus accordingly. By the time demo day arrived, the company had a focused value proposition. Data labeling for autonomous vehicles, initial traction, companies using the platform, and a narrative that was perfectly calibrated for venture capital evaluation. 2 elite credentialed technical founders, YC-backed, building the infrastructure layer for artificial intelligence. None of this was the product of visionary genius. All of it was the product of the Y Combinator machine operating on the raw material of 2 overflow zone founders' structural profiles. The machine iterated, the machine refined, the machine manufactured, and the output, the narrative product delivered at demo day, was investable. The checks followed, not because the idea was guaranteed to succeed, but because the narrative matched the pattern that investors had been trained, through decades of Y Combinator demo days, to fund. There is a dimension of the Scale AI funding story that is almost never examined with the structural seriousness it warrants, and it is perhaps the most consequential dimension of all. It is the dimension of aesthetic investability, the set of visual, biographical, narrative, and cultural markers that make a founder and a company appear worthy of a venture capital investment, independent of the underlying business fundamentals. Because early-stage venture capital investment is not, despite what the mythology suggests, primarily a function of business analysis. It is primarily a function of pattern matching, and the patterns that investors match against are not abstract financial models. They are narratives. They are templates. They are the specific biographical and presentational markers that investors have learned to associate with future returns, based on the patterns of past returns. When a venture capital investor evaluates a company at the Y Combinator demo day stage, a company that may have weeks of operating history, no meaningful revenue, an unvalidated business model, and a product that has pivoted multiple times, the investor is not evaluating the business. There is not enough business to evaluate. The investor is evaluating the founders. And the evaluation of the founders is not a rigorous, dispassionate assessment of capability. It is a rapid, intuition-driven pattern match against an internalized template of what a successful founder looks like. The template has specific features. Youth, ideally under 30, because youth signals adaptability, energy, and the absence of risk aversion that accumulates with age. Elite credentials, because credentials from MIT, Stanford, or Carnegie Mellon signal cognitive capability and the ability to survive competitive selection mechanisms. Technical competence, because founders who can build the product are perceived as lower execution risk. A departure narrative, dropout status, or an unconventional path, because deviation from the norm signals the risk tolerance that the mythology associates with entrepreneurial success. And a sector alignment, the founder should be building in a space that is currently attracting capital. But there is a subtler dimension to the template that operates at the level of aesthetic and cultural presentation, and this is where the analysis must go if it is going to be honest. The founder's appearance, manner of speaking, cultural presentation, and embodied confidence are signals that investors read, often unconsciously, as evidence of fit with the success template. And the template is not culturally neutral. It has been shaped by decades of pattern matching against founders who succeeded in previous eras, founders who were disproportionately white, male, and products of a specific cultural and educational background. However, and this is a critical structural nuance, the template has expanded over time to accommodate a specific subset of Asian American founders, particularly those who fit the model minority template. The model minority presentation, quiet technical competence, elite credentials, immigrant work ethic narrative, non-threatening demeanor, deference to established power structures, is a set of characteristics that venture capital has learned to associate with reliable execution and manageable interpersonal dynamics. The model minority founder is perceived as someone who will build the product, hit the milestones, manage the team efficiently, and not cause the kind of interpersonal turbulence that investors fear in more disruptive personality types. Wang and Guo's combined biographical narrative activated every element of the investability template. Son of physicists plus daughter of engineers, MIT plus Carnegie Mellon, Thiel Fellowship, Y Combinator, both technical, both young, both Chinese American, both dropouts, AI sector, data infrastructure. The narrative was so perfectly calibrated to the venture capital pattern matching machine that the question of whether the specific business would succeed was almost secondary. The narrative said, these are the kind of people who produce returns. And in early stage venture capital, the narrative is what gets funded. The initial funding followed, seed round closed, additional rounds followed as the company found traction, and each subsequent round of funding was itself an amplification mechanism. More capital meant more hires meant more product capability meant more customers meant more revenue meant a higher valuation, and a higher valuation meant more media attention, which meant more narrative reinforcement, which meant more investor interest. The flywheel was spinning, and the initial energy that set the flywheel in motion was not business fundamentals. It was narrative investability. It was the structural alignment between the founders' biographical profiles and the patterns the venture capital market was designed to reward. Now we must examine what scale AI actually is, not what the venture capital narrative frames it as, not what the media profiles describe, but what it structurally is at the level of how value is produced and distributed, because the reality of scale AI's business model reveals a dimension of the architecture that is essential to any honest accounting of how the wealth was generated. And this dimension, once you see it clearly, adds an entirely new layer of structural complexity to the mythology of Alexandr Wang, the young genius who built a billion-dollar AI company. Scale AI, stripped of its narrative packaging, is a labor intermediary. It sits between the companies that need large volumes of labeled data to train their AI models and the human workers who actually perform the labeling. The company provides the platform, the quality control systems, the enterprise sales interface, and the workforce management infrastructure. But the actual labor, the work of looking at images and drawing bounding boxes around objects, of reading text and categorizing it, of watching video footage and annotating it frame by frame, is performed by human beings. Over 100,000 human beings distributed across the globe, working primarily through Scale AI's subsidiaries, Remote Asks, and Outlier AI. These workers are overwhelmingly located in developing nations, the Philippines, Kenya, India, countries in Latin America, where the cost of labor is a fraction of what it would be in the United States or Western Europe. They are classified as independent contractors, not employees. They do not receive benefits, no health insurance, no retirement contributions, no paid time off. They do not receive guaranteed hours or guaranteed income. They are paid per task, and the compensation per task is, by the standards of the countries where Scale AI's clients and shareholders are located, extremely low. The economic structure is straightforward. The contract worker in the Philippines labels 1,000 images. They are paid per image, a few cents per image, perhaps less, depending on the complexity and the specific task. Scale AI delivers those 1,000 labeled images to a client, say OpenAI or the United States military, at a price that is many multiples of the labor cost. The margin between the cost of the labor and the price of the data product is where Scale AI's revenue comes from. And Scale AI generated approximately $870 million in revenue in 2024. That revenue, minus the company's operating costs, flows to the company's shareholders and stakeholders. And the largest individual stakeholder, until the Meta deal, was Alexandr Wang. This means that when you see Wang's name on the Forbes billionaires list, what you are looking at, in the most literal, structurally precise sense, is the accumulated margin between the cost of precarious global labor and the price that wealthy technology companies and government agencies are willing to pay for the products of that labor. The billion-dollar net worth is not a reward for genius. It is a financial expression of a structural arrangement that identifies, harnesses, and monetizes the most precarious workers in the global economy and channels the value they produce upward through the intermediary platform to the least precarious participants in the system, the founders, the investors, the shareholders. Scale AI has faced a class action lawsuit from contract workers alleging partially or fully unpaid work, and what the lawsuit characterizes as an extremely predatory relationship between the company and its workforce. The allegations include wage violations, chronic mismanagement, and a systematic pattern of extracting maximum labor at minimum cost. Wang is named as a defendant. The lawsuit is ongoing, and I make no claims about its merits. But the structural dynamic the lawsuit describes, the extraction of value from precarious workers through a platform that pays minimally and charges maximally, is not alleged. It is the business model. It is the documented, publicly known, investor-celebrated business model. And the mythology of individual transcendence serves a very specific function in this context. The mythology tells you that Wang's wealth is the product of his brilliance, his vision, his entrepreneurial daring, his ability to identify and build a company around a critical need in the AI ecosystem. And in telling you that, the mythology conceals the labor. It makes invisible the 100,000 contract workers who actually perform the work that produced the value. It makes invisible their precarity, the economic vulnerability that makes them available for this work at the prices scale AI pays. And it makes invisible the structural arrangement that channels the value they produce away from them and toward the individuals whose names appear on the Forbes list. Now we must address the single most important variable in the scale AI wealth creation story. A variable that has nothing to do with Alexandr Wang's intelligence, nothing to do with his effort, nothing to do with his vision, and nothing to do with any other individual quality. That variable is temporal alignment, the degree to which an individual or company's trajectory happens to coincide with a systemic shift that amplifies the value of whatever they are building. And temporal alignment is, by definition, not a function of individual capability. It is a function of when you started, where you were positioned when the shift occurred, and how legible your existing operations were to the institutions that responded to the shift. Scale AI was founded in 2016. In 2016, artificial intelligence was a real and growing field, but it had not yet achieved the cultural and economic centrality it would achieve after November of 2022, when OpenAI launched ChatGPT. The autonomous vehicle sector, Scale AI's initial primary market, was well-funded but geographically concentrated and populated by a finite set of major clients. If the AI industry had remained at the scale and trajectory it exhibited in 2016, Scale AI would likely have been a successful but modest company, a solid Y Combinator outcome, a comfortable business, not a $29 billion company, not a Forbes billionaire. What happened was the AI wave. And the AI wave was produced by a specific set of technical breakthroughs that Wang had no involvement in and no influence over. The discovery of scaling laws by researchers at OpenAI in 2018 and 2019 demonstrated that model performance increases predictably with increases in model size, training data, and computational resources. This discovery transformed the AI industry's investment thesis from better algorithms to more data, more compute, bigger models. And more data meant exponentially more demand for the specific service Scale AI provided, labeled training data. The scaling laws were not discovered by Wang. The transformer architecture that made large language models possible was not invented by Wang. GPT-2, GPT-3, GPT-4 were not built by Wang. The cultural explosion triggered by ChatGPT's launch in November 2022 was not caused by Wang. The hundreds of billions of dollars in capital that poured into AI companies between 2020 and 2025 were not deployed because of Wang. All of these developments, the technical breakthroughs, the capital flows, the cultural moment, the geopolitical competition, were systemic forces operating at a scale that dwarfs the influence of any individual. But Scale AI was positioned, by virtue of its founding date, its business model, its existing client relationships, and its Y Combinator manufactured credibility, Scale AI was positioned to ride the wave when it arrived. When demand for labeled training data exploded, Scale AI was already in the market, already had the platform, already had the workforce, already had the enterprise relationships. The company did not need to build from scratch. It needed to scale what it already had. And scaling existing infrastructure into a surging market is a fundamentally different and fundamentally easier proposition than building new infrastructure from nothing. The temporal alignment with the AI wave is what transformed Scale AI from a data labeling company into an essential AI infrastructure provider. It is what transformed the valuation from hundreds of millions to billions. It is what attracted the Pentagon contracts, the media attention, the Meta acquisition. And it is the single variable that, more than any other, explains the magnitude of the outcome. Remove the AI wave, and you remove the billionaire. The individual stays the same. The outcome changes by orders of magnitude. That is what temporal alignment means, and that is why the mythology of individual transcendence is structurally inadequate as an explanation for extreme wealth. There is a biographical detail about Alexandr Wang that appears casually in media profiles and is never examined with the structural seriousness it demands. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Alexandr Wang was roommates with Sam Altman. Sam Altman, the former president of Y Combinator, the CEO of OpenAI, the man who would launch ChatGPT in November of 2022 and become arguably the most influential individual in the global technology industry. The founder of Scale AI, a company whose primary business is providing the training data that AI models need, was sharing a living space with the CEO of the company building the most consequential AI models on the planet. They were not distant professional acquaintances. They were not LinkedIn connections who had met once at a conference. They were roommates. They shared daily proximity during one of the most pivotal periods in the history of the technology industry. This is not a minor detail. This is a structural revelation. Because in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, proximity is power. The density and quality of your connections to the individuals who control capital, make strategic decisions, and set the direction of the most important companies determine the ceiling of your opportunities in ways that individual capability cannot override. You can be the most brilliant data labeling entrepreneur in the world, and if you do not have personal access to the people building the models that need labeled data, your brilliance operates within the constraints of your network's reach. Conversely, you can be a competent but not extraordinary entrepreneur, and if you have intimate, daily, informal access to the most important decision maker in the AI ecosystem, the constraints of your reach expand to dimensions that are almost limitless. How did Wang end up as roommates with Altman? The public record does not provide a detailed explanation, but the structural logic is transparent. Both were products of the Y Combinator ecosystem. Altman served as president of Y Combinator from 2014 to 2019. Wang was a Y Combinator alum from the summer 2016 batch. The Y Combinator alumni network is among the most tightly knit professional networks in the technology industry. Alumni maintain relationships that extend far beyond the professional into the personal. The roommate arrangement was the product of shared network membership, a structural consequence of occupying the same institutional ecosystem. And the value of that proximity is structurally incalculable. Daily, informal, unstructured access to the CEO of OpenAI during the period when OpenAI was developing the technology that would reshape the global economy. What does that access mean? It means information, not insider information in the legal sense, but strategic context, understanding the direction of AI development at a level of granularity that no public analysis can provide. Knowing what is coming before the market knows, understanding which capabilities are being developed, which bottlenecks exist, which infrastructure needs are emerging. It means positioning, the ability to align your company's products, hiring, and strategic partnerships with the trajectory of the market's most important player, with a temporal advantage measured in years, not months. It means social capital, a personal relationship with one of the most powerful people in the industry that provides a foundation for business relationships that would be impossible to establish through formal channels. The network is not built through merit. The network is built through structural position, where you went to school, which accelerator you went through, which ecosystem absorbed you when you entered the overflow zone. Once inside the network amplifies everything. Your ideas reach the right ears. Your company gets funded by the right investors. Your products are adopted by the right clients. The mythology says this happened because you were brilliant. The architecture says this happened because you were proximate. And proximity is architecturally determined. The relationship between Scale AI and the United States military represents the point at which the structural analysis must expand beyond the dynamics of venture capital and startup ecosystems and into the domain of geopolitics, state power, and the military-industrial complex. Because the defense contracts that Scale AI secured were not merely a business line, they were a structural amplifier that transformed the company's valuation, its competitive positioning, its institutional legitimacy, and its founder's personal trajectory in ways that no amount of commercial success alone could have produced. Scale AI began receiving defense contracts as the U.S. government's investment in artificial intelligence accelerated in the late 2010s. The company was tapped by the Pentagon's Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, the CDAO, to test and evaluate the safety and reliability of large language models for military planning and decision-making. The company developed a product called Donovan, an AI suite for the federal government that integrates data from multiple sources and enables military operators to query sensor feeds, map data, and generate courses of action using large language models. The significance of defense contracts in the startup ecosystem cannot be overstated. They serve a dual function. First, revenue. Government contracts provide stable, long-term, high-margin revenue that is less subject to the volatility of commercial markets and the competitive dynamics of the enterprise sales cycle. Second, and more importantly, legitimacy. A company that has been vetted by the Pentagon, granted access to classified systems, trusted with the data infrastructure of military decision-making is a fundamentally different entity in the eyes of commercial clients, investors, and acquirers than a company that serves only commercial customers. Government contracts are the ultimate institutional stamp of approval. They signal that the company has been evaluated not just on technical capability, but on security practices, organizational integrity, and the ability to operate within the most demanding compliance architecture in the world. Wang's personal role in positioning Scale AI for government work was significant and structurally revealing. He became a public advocate for AI's role in national security, framing the development of AI as a geopolitical race between the United States and China. He wrote directly to President Trump, declaring that America must win the AI war. He spoke at the World Economic Forum about the competitive dynamics between U.S. and Chinese AI capabilities, particularly in the context of DeepSeek. He met with world leaders, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, French President Emmanuel Macron, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. This level of political engagement is not typical for a 20-something startup CEO. It reflects a deliberate narrative positioning that aligned Scale AI with the strategic priorities of the national security establishment. And the positioning activated a specific biographical template that the defense establishment finds compelling. The Chinese-American founder who publicly advocates for American technological supremacy over China. This template carries enormous symbolic weight. It performs ideological work. It demonstrates that Chinese Americans are loyal, that their allegiance is to America, that they are strategic assets in the competition with China rather than potential liabilities. Whether Wang's advocacy reflects sincere conviction, strategic calculation, or some combination of both is not something I can assess from the outside. What I can assess is the structural function of the narrative, and the structural function is clear. It opens doors that would be closed to founders without this specific biographical and ideological profile. The defense contracts amplified Scale AI's valuation by adding a dimension of institutional legitimacy and strategic importance that pure commercial operations cannot provide. A company that serves Meta and OpenAI is a technology company. A company that serves Meta, OpenAI, and the Pentagon is a national security asset. And the market values national security assets differently, with a premium that reflects not just revenue, but strategic indispensability. In June of 2025, Meta Platforms invested $14.3 billion in Scale AI, acquiring a 49% stake. The deal more than doubled Scale AI's valuation to approximately $29 billion. As part of the deal, Alexandr Wang stepped down as CEO of Scale AI and joined Meta in a leadership role, while retaining his position on Scale AI's board and maintaining his equity stake. Meta announced that Scale AI would operate under the umbrella of Meta Superintelligence Labs. This deal is the structural climax of the Alexandr Wang story, and it reveals the paradox of the alternative path with blinding clarity. Let me trace the paradox precisely. If Wang had stayed at MIT, if he had completed his degree in mathematics and computer science, if he had followed the traditional pipeline, the pipeline that runs from MIT through FANG internships, through full-time employment, through progressive career advancement, his best-case scenario, the absolute ceiling of the traditional path, would have been a senior leadership position at a major technology company, director of engineering, VP of engineering, maybe eventually a C-suite role. At Meta or Google or Amazon, he would have reached that position in his late 30s or early 40s, after 15 to 20 years of climbing the corporate ladder, navigating the compliance architecture at every level, competing against thousands of equally credentialed peers for a diminishing number of senior positions. The total compensation, including equity, might have reached $15 to $20 million over the course of his career. An excellent outcome by any conventional measure, but an outcome bounded by the resolution of the pipeline he was in. Instead, by exiting the pipeline, by entering the overflow zone, by being absorbed into the Y Combinator alternative pipeline, by riding the AI wave, by leveraging the network architecture, by positioning for government contracts, by constructing a narrative of national security importance, he arrived at a leadership position at Meta at age 28, not as a VP who worked his way up over 2 decades, but as the founder of a company that Meta spent $14 billion to acquire. He arrived at the same structural destination, FANG leadership, but at an elevation that is orders of magnitude higher than what the traditional pipeline could have produced. The dropout ended up at Meta in a more powerful position than the graduate could have achieved through 20 years of conventional advancement. And the wealth differential is staggering. Wang's net worth, post-Meta deal, is in the billions. The hypothetical MIT graduate who stayed on the traditional path and became a VP of engineering at Meta might be worth 15 or 20 million. The deviation from the traditional path produced a return that exceeds the traditional path's best case by a factor of 100 or more. This is the paradox of resolution arbitrage taken to its logical extreme. The alternative path did not just match the traditional path's outcome, it exceeded it by orders of magnitude. And then it curved back and intersected with the traditional path's destination, Wang leadership, but from a position of such extreme leverage that the intersection was, in effect, a conquest. The system that Wang left, the system that would have contained him as one of thousands of competent engineers climbing a well-defined ladder, ended up writing a $14 billion check to access what he built outside its walls. And the structural lesson is profound. The traditional path and the alternative path are not truly separate. They are components of a single, larger architecture. The traditional path produces the overflow that feeds the alternative path. The alternative path, when it succeeds spectacularly, feeds back into the traditional system at a higher level. If you succeed on the traditional path, the system captures your labor through employment. If you succeed on the alternative path, the system captures your output through acquisition. Either way, the system wins. The only variable is the level of leverage at which the individual participates, and that level is determined by structural position, not by talent. We cannot tell this story with full structural honesty without confronting the racial dimension. And the racial dimension of the Alexandr Wang narrative is not what the mainstream media presents it as. The media presents Wang's story as a triumph of the model minority, the Asian American who worked hard, studied harder, and achieved the American dream through meritorious effort. This presentation is not merely oversimplified, it is structurally harmful. It is a narrative that serves the interests of the systems that produce and maintain racial hierarchy in America while appearing to celebrate the success of a historically marginalized group. The model minority narrative has a specific history. The term emerged in the 1960s, deployed primarily by white commentators and media outlets as a rhetorical instrument to discredit the civil rights movement and the demands of Black Americans for structural reform. The logic was direct and poisonous. If Asian Americans can succeed through hard work and education, then the failure of Black Americans to achieve equivalent outcomes must be the result of cultural deficiency rather than structural oppression. The narrative thus served a dual function. It superficially praised Asian Americans while weaponizing their success against Black Americans, all in service of protecting the structural status quo from critique. In the context of Wang's story, the model minority narrative performs a specific structural function. It attributes his success to cultural values, the emphasis on education, the work ethic, the quiet ambition stereotypically attributed to Asian Americans. And in doing so, it conceals every element of the structural architecture we have spent this commentary illuminating. It tells you Wang succeeded because he was the right kind of person. It does not tell you he succeeded because he was born in the right place, to the right parents with the right structural configuration at the right time, and was processed through the right institutional machinery. The narrative also conceals the diversity of Asian American experience. For every Wang on the Forbes list, there are millions of Asian Americans whose trajectories were shaped by the same cultural emphasis on education, but who encountered structural conditions, poverty, discrimination, geographic isolation, immigration precarity, linguistic barriers, that the model minority narrative renders invisible. Hmong Americans, Cambodian Americans, Burmese Americans, and many other subgroups experience poverty and educational disadvantage at rates that directly contradict the model minority template. The template erases them. It presents the success of a highly selected subset, the children of professionally credentialed East Asian immigrants, as representative of the entire Asian American population. And the model minority narrative performs one more structural function that is specific to Wang's story. The celebration of Wang as a model minority, the quiet, technically brilliant, institutionally validated Asian American success story, implicitly reinforces the message that the American system is fundamentally fair, that outcomes reflect effort, that structural critique is unnecessary because individual achievement is possible. This message serves the interests of the individuals and institutions at the top of the hierarchy. It does not serve the interests of the Asian Americans navigating the bamboo ceiling, the structural barrier that prevents Asian Americans from advancing into senior leadership positions at rates proportional to their representation in the professional workforce. Wang's deviation from the traditional pipeline can itself be read as a structural response to the bamboo ceiling, an implicit recognition that the traditional path's ceiling for someone with his specific demographic profile was lower than the alternative path's ceiling. The highest levels of corporate leadership at American technology companies remain overwhelmingly occupied by white men. The path from MIT to VP of engineering at Meta, the path the traditional pipeline would have offered Wang, is a path that runs directly into that barrier. The alternative path, by circumventing the corporate hierarchy entirely and arriving at the same destination through acquisition rather than promotion, circumvented the bamboo ceiling as well. One of the most structurally significant insights embedded in the Alexandr Wang story is the concept of cultural script obsolescence, the phenomenon in which the strategic playbook that worked for one generation becomes partially or fully inoperative for the next generation due to systemic shifts that the playbook was not designed to anticipate. And this concept applies not just to Wang's family, but to millions of families across America who are operating from scripts that were optimized for a version of the American economic system that no longer exists in its original form. Wang's parents operated from a cultural script that was common among Chinese immigrant professionals who arrived in the United States in the 1980s and 90s. The script was specific and well-tested. Secure a position in a prestigious technical field, invest heavily in your children's education, channel them toward elite universities and STEM degrees, and guide them into stable, high-compensation careers at major institutions. This script was not arbitrary or irrational. It was a sophisticated adaptation to a specific version of the American economic system, a version in which technical talent was genuinely scarce, elite credentials were reliable differentiators, the path from a top CS degree to a six-figure career was relatively linear, and the number of competitors for any given position was manageable. But the system shifted. By the time Wang reached the critical junctures, MIT, the job market, the decision about what to do after leaving MIT, the system had changed in ways the parental script did not account for. The supply of elite credentialed technical talent had expanded massively. The number of CS graduates from top programs had grown by multiples, driven by the explosive growth of the tech industry and the widespread perception that a CS degree was a guaranteed path to financial security. This supply increase meant that the signaling value of an MITCS credential, while still substantial, was significantly less differentiating than it had been a generation earlier. The pipeline was more crowded, the filters were tighter, and the returns to following the script, while still positive in absolute terms, were less reliably exceptional than when the script was written. The startup ecosystem had evolved into a parallel path that offered returns the traditional pipeline could not match. But the parental script did not include entrepreneurship. The script was oriented towards stability, institutional employment, known quantities. Entrepreneurship was risk, and the parents' entire strategic framework was built on risk minimization, because they had immigrated from a country where the consequences of risk were severe, and they had navigated the American system successfully by following rules, meeting expectations, and building incrementally. The structural irony is that the very script that positioned Wang to succeed, the emphasis on education, the investment in quantitative training, the channeling toward MIT, was also the script he ultimately had to deviate from to achieve the outsized outcome the script aspired to, but could not deliver through its own mechanisms. The script got him to MIT. But the script's intended path through MIT was a path that, in 2016's structural conditions, was less likely to produce a Forbes-level outcome than the alternative path that deviation from the script made possible. This is the tragedy and revelation of cultural script obsolescence. The parents sacrificed enormously. They navigated the immigration system with extraordinary skill. They created conditions for their child that were objectively remarkable. And yet, the playbook they transmitted, the map they drew, was a map of a territory that had partially shifted beneath their feet. The children who succeeded most spectacularly were not the children who followed the map most faithfully. They were the children who, whether by choice or by structural expulsion, deviated from the map at precisely the moment when deviation aligned with the forces reshaping the economic landscape. There is a structural illusion that operates every time a success story is told, and it is so pervasive, so deeply embedded in how narratives are constructed and consumed, that most people never identify it as an illusion at all. The illusion is survivorship bias, the systematic overrepresentation of successful outcomes and the systematic erasure of unsuccessful ones. And in the context of the Alexandr Wang story, survivorship bias is not just a cognitive distortion. It is a structural mechanism that actively conceals the true distribution of outcomes and replaces it with a false distribution that makes the mythology of individual transcendence appear empirically valid. Here is how survivorship bias operates in this specific context. You see Alexandr Wang on the Forbes list. You read the profile. MIT dropout, YC alum, Scale AI founder, billionaire at 25. And because you see this story, because it is visible, prominent, repeated across dozens of media outlets, your brain treats it as evidence about the probability of this kind of outcome. Your brain says, there is a path from MIT dropout to billionaire. If I follow the right steps or possess the right qualities, this outcome is attainable. The visibility of the story creates a perceived probability that is dramatically higher than the actual probability. Now, consider what you do not see. You do not see the hundreds of other companies in the Y Combinator Summer 2016 batch. YC admits several hundred companies per batch. Most of those companies no longer exist. Some achieved modest outcomes, small acquisitions, sustainable but unremarkable businesses, comfortable lifestyles for their founders. A handful achieved significant outcomes. Scale AI achieved an extraordinary outcome, but the extraordinary outcome is the one that gets profiled. The modest outcomes are invisible. The failures are invisible, and the invisible non-successes, in aggregate, constitute the vast majority of the distribution. You do not see the thousands of MIT computer science students who graduated in the same era as Wang. Most of them followed the traditional pipeline. Most of them work as engineers at technology companies. Most of them earn between $150,000 and $400,000 in total compensation, depending on their seniority and their employer. These are excellent outcomes by any absolute measure, but they are not Forbes outcomes. They are not the outcomes that get profiled. They are not the outcomes that generate the mythology. And because they are invisible, their existence does not register as evidence about the actual distribution of outcomes for MIT CS students. The only outcome that registers is the extreme outlier, and the outlier, by appearing in isolation, creates the false impression that it is representative. For every product manager making $600,000 in total compensation at a fine company, the kind of outcome that the traditional pipeline holds up as its success case, there are hundreds of applicants who did not get that position. Those hundreds of people have the same credentials, the same skills, the same educational backgrounds. They are functionally interchangeable from the system's perspective, but the system has a finite number of positions and a massive surplus of qualified applicants. And the difference between the applicant who gets the position and the hundreds who do not is not talent. It is structural position, timing, network, interview performance on a specific day, the specific preferences of a specific hiring manager, the specific headcount available in a specific quarter. It is the invisible architecture of selection that operates beneath the stated criteria. When you compare your life to the life of Alexandr Wang, when you feel the gap between where you are and where he is, you are not comparing yourself to a representative outcome. You are comparing yourself to a statistical outlier at the extreme right tail of the distribution, and the gap between your position and that outlier's position is not a measure of your inadequacy. It is a measure of the distance between the median of the distribution and its furthest extreme. A distance that, for any given individual, is determined almost entirely by structural forces, temporal alignment, network geometry, narrative legibility, precarity configuration, institutional selection, and almost not at all by individual capability. The 700 applicants hold that image. For every position filled, 700 qualified people did not get it. For every company funded, dozens of equally promising companies were not funded. For every founder on the Forbes list, thousands of equally capable individuals are invisible. The mythology exists to make you forget the 700. The architecture exists to select the one, and the selection criteria are not what the mythology tells you they are. Let us now synthesize the complete architecture. 14 structural layers, each one determinative, each one operating beneath the surface of the narrative, each one invisible to anyone who has not been given the lens to see it. Let me walk through them in sequence, because the power of this analysis is not in any individual insight. It is in the totality, in the accumulated weight of 14 distinct structural forces, each independently significant, each compounding the others, each contributing to an outcome that appears miraculous only because the architecture that produced it has been systematically hidden. Layer 1, parental structural position. 2 Chinese immigrant physicists at Los Alamos National Laboratory. This layer provides financial stability, cognitive environment, cultural capital, immigration security, and a highly specific cultural script that channels the child toward elite technical education. This layer is entirely inherited. Wang did not choose his parents, his birthplace, or the structural advantages they conferred. Layer 2, geographic position. Los Alamos, New Mexico, a federally constructed scientific community with the highest PhD per capita concentration in America, a high-resource school system, and ambient cultural norms organized around quantitative reasoning and academic achievement. This layer amplifies the parental advantage by embedding the child in a community that normalizes and supports the specific trajectory the parental script prescribes. Layer 3, educational pipeline entry. Math counts, competition success, USA, computing Olympiad participation, early graduation from Los Alamos High School, and admission to MIT. Each waypoint is a selection mechanism that sorts the child into an increasingly narrow pipeline of identified talent. Each waypoint is made accessible by the structural advantages of the preceding layers. Layer 4, compliance, architecture friction. MIT's computer science program, with its specific competitive intensity, social dynamics, and cultural norms, generates friction with Wang's specific structural preparation. The friction accumulates, Wang exits. Not from incompetence, from misalignment between his structural position and the system's unstated demands. Layer 5, overflow zone. Wang enters the liminal space of elevated precarity and residual prestige. The MIT brand travels with him. The degree does not. The traditional pipeline is closing. The alternative pipeline is the most viable path forward. Layer 6, Quora absorption and co-founder convergence. Wang meets Lucy Guo, another overflow zone individual with a parallel structural trajectory. Their combined profiles create a narrative package of extraordinary legibility. The convergence is architecturally determined by the Silicon Valley ecosystem's function as a catchment basin for elite pipeline overflow. Layer 7, Y Combinator manufacturing. The YC machine admits the team, enforces the batch process, facilitates pivots from general API to chatbot data to autonomous vehicle labeling, and manufactures a fundable narrative for demo day. The output is a narrative product calibrated for venture capital consumption. Layer 8, aesthetic investability. The combined biographical narrative, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Thiel Fellowship, YC, AI, data, model minority aesthetic, activates every pattern-matching heuristic in the venture capital evaluation system. The check is written for the narrative, not for the business, which is still finding its shape. Layer 9, temporal alignment, scale. AI is founded at the precise historical moment when the AI industry is entering exponential growth. The scaling laws, discovered by others, create unprecedented demand for the specific service scale AI provides. The ChatGPT cultural moment amplifies demand further. Wang does not create the wave. Wang rides the wave. The wave produces the valuation. Layer 10, labor architecture. Over 100,000 contract workers globally perform the data labeling that generates scale AI's revenue. The margin between the cost of their labor and the price clients pay for labeled data is the source of scale AI's revenue and Wang's wealth. The workers' precarity, their economic vulnerability, their lack of alternatives, is structurally constitutive of the business model. Layer 11, network geometry. Wang's embeddedness in the Y Combinator alumni network connects him to Sam Altman, to venture capital investors, to enterprise clients, and to the broader Silicon Valley power structure. The roommate relationship with the CEO of OpenAI provides a level of strategic proximity that is architecturally produced by shared institutional membership. Layer 12, government contract pipeline, scale. AI secures Pentagon contracts through a combination of technical capability, institutional credibility, and Wang's personal narrative positioning as a Chinese-American advocate for American AI supremacy. The defense contracts provide revenue, legitimacy, and competitive advantage. Layer 13, narrative manufacturing. The media, operating within its own compliance architecture that rewards stories of individual transcendence, produces and amplifies the mythology of Wang as a genius founder. The mythology conceals the architecture. The concealment protects the mythology. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Layer 14, Meta acquisition. Meta invests $14.3 billion for 49% of scale AI. Wang joins Meta leadership. The alternative path curves back to the traditional path's destination, Fang leadership, but at an elevation that exceeds the traditional path's ceiling by orders of magnitude. The architecture completes its circuit. Every layer is structurally determined. Every layer depends on conditions that Wang did not create, could not control, and in many cases did not choose. The individual contribution, intelligence, effort, decision-making, execution, sits on top of this architecture. It is real, it is necessary, but it is not, by any honest structural accounting, the primary cause of the outcome. The primary cause is the architecture. The architecture produced the billionaire, and the architecture has been invisible until now. If you have followed this commentary to this point, you are sitting with a set of realizations that are likely uncomfortable, possibly destabilizing, and ultimately, if you allow them to be, profoundly liberating. You are sitting with the recognition that the outcomes you have observed in the world around you, the success stories, the wealth concentrations, the career trajectories that seem to defy explanation, are not the product of individual qualities that you lack. They are the product of structural configurations that were arranged by forces largely beyond any individual's control in ways that amplified certain people and constrained others. And the question that naturally follows is, what do I do with this recognition? If the architecture is what determines outcomes, and the architecture is largely inherited and unchosen, does that mean I have no agency? Does structural analysis lead to structural fatalism? No. And this is critical. Understanding the architecture does not mean accepting that your position within it is fixed. Understanding the architecture is the prerequisite for navigating it strategically. You cannot optimize a position you have not mapped. You cannot execute resolution arbitrage if you do not know what resolution means. You cannot align temporally with a wave if you do not know what a wave looks like. You cannot reduce precarity if you have not identified where your precarity lives. The mythology of individual transcendence tells you to work harder, dream bigger, develop more grit, cultivate more vision. And those things are not worthless, but they are necessary conditions, not sufficient conditions. And they are dramatically less effective than structural position optimization. Structural position optimization means asking a specific set of questions that the mythology never teaches you to ask. First, what is my precarity configuration? Map it, all of it. Every vulnerability, debt, dependence on a specific employer, geographic constraint, legal status, health conditions, family obligations, network sparsity, credential gaps. The map is the prerequisite for any strategic action, because you cannot reduce what you have not identified. Second, what is the compliance architecture of my current system? What are the unstated rules? What are the real evaluation criteria? Who advances and who does not? And what distinguishes them along the hidden dimensions? If you cannot answer these questions, you're navigating blind, and navigating blind in a system that selects for containability is a recipe for stagnation. Third, am I in the overflow zone? Is the system I am in filtering me out? Am I close to the threshold but below it? Am I accumulating friction that is pushing me toward exit? And if so, is that friction a signal that I should double down on compliance? Or is it a signal that the alternative pipeline might offer a higher return on my structural advantages? Fourth, where is the resolution differential? In what adjacent system would my existing credentials, skills, and structural advantages place me above the threshold instead of below it? Where am I disproportionately credentialed relative to the evaluation standards of the system? Where would my MIT equivalent branding, whatever form that takes in my specific context, generate maximum amplification? Fifth, where is the temporal wave? Which markets, which industries, which sectors are entering the exponential growth phase that creates the conditions for outsized returns? And how do I position myself, geographically, professionally, and narratively, to intersect with that wave at the moment of maximum amplification? These are not the questions the mythology teaches you to ask. The mythology teaches you to ask, am I working hard enough? Am I talented enough? Am I dreaming big enough? And those questions, while not entirely useless, are the wrong questions, because they direct your attention inward, at your individual qualities, rather than outward, at the structural conditions that determine how much return those qualities generate. And the return is what matters, not the effort, not the talent, the return, and the return is a function of position, not of person. We began this commentary with a simple image, a name on a list, Alexandr Wang, 25 years old, $1 billion, artificial intelligence, and we asked the question that the list is designed to prevent you from asking. How did this actually happen? Not the mythology, not the narrative, the actual structural mechanics. And the answer, as we have now traced with granular, uncomfortable, hyper-technical precision across 20 sections and 14 structural layers, is architecture. A confluence of inherited advantages, institutional pipelines, systemic selection mechanisms, temporal coincidences, network geometries, narrative manufactures, labor extraction systems, and geopolitical forces that converged at a specific moment around a specific individual in a specific configuration to produce an outcome that appears miraculous from the outside but is, from the structural perspective, entirely comprehensible, legible, mappable, explicable without recourse to the mythology of individual transcendence. Alexandr Wang is intelligent. Alexandr Wang works hard. Alexandr Wang made decisions that were, in many cases, well adapted to the structural conditions he navigated. These things are real. They are necessary components of the outcome, but they are not the primary cause. The primary cause is the architecture, an architecture of 14 layers, each structurally determined, each compounding the others, each operating beneath the surface of the narrative that the mythology constructs to keep you from seeing it. And the mythology's function, its structural function, the reason it exists and persists and is reproduced with such relentless consistency across every media profile and every keynote speech and every Forbes list, is to protect the architecture from scrutiny. Because if you see the architecture, you ask different questions. You ask why the returns are distributed the way they are. You ask who benefits from the distribution and who is harmed by it. You ask whether the 100,000 contract workers who actually produced the labeled data deserve a different share of the value their labor created. You ask whether the structural advantages that made Wang's trajectory possible, parental occupation, geographic position, immigration stability, financial buffer, cultural capital, institutional branding, network density, temporal alignment, should be more widely distributed. You ask whether the system that celebrates a 25-year-old billionaire while rendering invisible the precarious workers who produced the value is a system that deserves the legitimacy the mythology confers upon it. These are the questions the mythology is designed to suppress. And the fact that you are now equipped to ask them, the fact that you have the lens, the framework, the 14-layer structural map, means that the mythology has, for you, lost its power. You can still see the Forbes list, you can still read the profiles, you can still encounter the narratives of individual transcendence, but you will see them differently. You will see through them, you will see the architecture beneath the surface, and you will see it not with cynicism, but with clarity. I want to close with an invitation, not an argument, an invitation. Carry this lens forward, apply it to every success story you encounter. Apply it to the tech founder, the investment banker, the influencer, the politician. In every case, ask, what is the architecture? You will not always be able to map it completely. The architecture is designed to be difficult to see, but the act of asking, The act of refusing the mythology and insisting on the structure is itself a form of power that the mythology is specifically designed to deny you. The architecture is visible now. What you do with that visibility is the only thing that was ever truly in your hands.